There are moments that define you, moments where you choose who you will be. 4 years ago, Victoria Hendricks chose wrong. Today, sitting across from a 16-year-old girl and her father in Administrative Hearing Room 4B of the Monroe Federal Courthouse, she was about to do it again. Victoria had woken that morning at 5:30, the way she did every weekday. Shower, coffee, the same style of suit she wore every day, professional armor that made her feel competent even when she felt anything but. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror and practiced the expression she would wear in the hearing. Neutral, authoritative, the face of someone who knew what she was doing. The apartment around her was small but carefully maintained. Photos of Emily lined the hallway, a visual chronicle of motherhood that ended abruptly at age 18. After that, the photos were sparse. A graduation ceremony where Emily's smile did not reach her eyes. The documentation of a relationship that had fractured and never properly healed. She had driven to the courthouse through morning traffic, the web case file reviewed and ready. Simple, straightforward, exactly the kind of thing she had handled dozens of times. Alleged assault between minors, evidence to collect, procedures to follow. A routine hearing that should take no more than an hour. She had no idea that the next hour would destroy the life she had spent 20 years building. Now, sitting in Administrative Hearing Room 4B, with the fluorescent lights humming overhead, Victoria arranged her files with the precision she had learned over 2 decades of compliance work. Everything in its place. Everything according to procedure. The lights made time feel slower, heavier, like moving through water. The girl wore a volleyball team hoodie. There was a blood stain on the left sleeve, dark brown now, oxidized. Her shoulders curved inward the way frightened animals curl into themselves. The backpack straps clutched in her hands might as well have been lifelines. Sophie Webb, the file said, 16 years old, alleged assault of Tyler Ashford, age 16, son of City Councilman Bradley Ashford. Incident occurred in the school cafeteria at 12:40 p.m. yesterday. The boy had fallen, struck his head on a table edge, sustained a minor laceration. The blood on Sophie's hoodie was his. Evidence. Victoria had said these words 100 times before, 1,000 times. They came easily, smoothly, with the weight of protocol behind them. We will need her to remove the clothing she was wearing. Standard evidence preservation. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. The girl's father sat beside her. Marcus Webb, the file said, 55 years old, employed as maintenance engineer at this very courthouse for nearly 3 years. Victoria had seen him in the hallways, maybe, fixing door hinges or adjusting thermostats. The kind of worker who becomes invisible through sheer competence and silence. He wore the standard issue work jacket, his maintenance badge clipped to the belt, scuffed boots, calloused hands resting flat on the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not even stand. He simply leaned forward slightly, palm steady against the table edge, eyes meeting Victoria's with an unsettling calm. Put that on the record. Exactly what you were asking. Why? Victoria had been doing this work for 4 years. Before that, 16 years in various administrative positions within the juvenile justice system. She knew resistance when she heard it. Most parents pleaded. Some shouted. A few cried. This man did none of those things. He asked a question the way someone asks about the weather, neutral and precise, but there was something underneath it. A foundation she could not quite identify. She cited the evidence preservation protocol. She explained the necessity of collecting clothing worn during the alleged incident. She spoke with the confidence that came from training, from manuals, from supervisors who had told her this was the correct procedure. If she refuses, we document non-cooperation. Her assistant, Grace Martinez, shifted uncomfortably in the chair beside her. The court clerk, Daniel Chen, had stopped typing. Even the security officer near the door seemed to be holding his breath. Marcus Webb waited. He waited the way a man waits who has spent years learning that silence creates pressure better than noise. When Victoria finished speaking, he nodded once. Then you will not mind submitting that procedure in writing, with a statutory basis for the court. A flicker of something passed through Victoria's chest. Irritation, maybe, or recognition. She could not tell. This is standard protocol in cases involving minors. I am asking whether it is a request or a compulsion. The difference mattered. Victoria knew that. But in her training, In the manuals, in the rushed conversations with supervisors who cared more about metrics than nuance. The line between request and compulsion had blurred into a gray space where procedure lived. She pivoted the way she had been taught. If the procedure itself was questioned, question something else. Create doubt in a different direction. There may be inconsistencies with the identification provided. Victoria gestured to the school ID card lying on the table. If we cannot verify identity properly, everything attached to this file becomes questionable. The ID was passed forward. A small plastic rectangle, ordinary and unremarkable. The kind of thing no one looked at twice. Daniel Chen took it, examined it with the careful attention of someone who had spent 15 years as a court clerk learning to see what others missed. He paused. "Your Honor." Daniel looked up toward Judge Patricia Moreland, who had entered quietly during the exchange, and now sat reviewing the preliminary file. "There is something here you may want to see." Judge Moreland was 62 years old, with 25 years on the bench, and a reputation for fairness that came with its own kind of weight. She took the ID, examined it beneath the desk lamp, and her expression shifted into something between curiosity and concern. "What am I looking at, Mr. Chen?" "An embedded certification code, Your Honor, from the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework implemented in this district in 2018. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Victoria knew the framework. Every compliance officer knew it, at least in theory. There had been training sessions, slide presentations, summary documents highlighting key points. But the actual framework document, the full legal text with all its provisions and safeguards, that lived in a binder somewhere in her office that she had never opened. The summaries were enough. The training materials covered what mattered. Or so she had believed. Judge Moreland requested the full framework document. Daniel retrieved it. A thick binder, official Department of Justice seal embossed on the cover, dated 2018. He placed it on the bench with a solid thump that seemed louder than it should have been. The judge began to read aloud, her voice steady and deliberate. "No minor shall be subject to invasive evidence collection without written parental consent, and independent advocacy and court authorization." Each word landed with precision. "Procedures that compromise dignity shall be prohibited absent exigent circumstances documented in writing." Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. Evidence theater, creating the appearance of necessity to compel compliance, is explicitly forbidden. The judge looked up. "Ms. Hendricks, were you familiar with these provisions before today?" Victoria's mouth was dry. "I reviewed the training materials, Your Honor." "The training materials are not the framework. Did you read the actual legal document?" Silence. "I see." Judge Moreland set the binder aside. "Who authored this framework? I remember implementing it, but the details have faded." Daniel Chen turned to the authorship page, his expression shifting into something Victoria could not quite read. He cleared his throat softly. "Principal Architect, Marcus Webb, Senior Policy Advisor, Department of Justice, Juvenile Justice Reform Division, 2017 through 2018. Every head in the room turned. Marcus Webb, in his maintenance jacket with his scuffed boots and his quiet voice, sat exactly as he had been sitting. He did not seem surprised by the revelation. He did not seem proud. He simply existed in the moment, with the same steady calm he had shown throughout. Victoria's world tilted. The invisible maintenance worker was the architect of the framework she had just violated. The man who fixed toilets and door hinges had written the legal protections she had been trained to circumvent. Judge Moreland leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes moving between Victoria and Marcus. "Mr. Webb, you are the Marcus Webb who authored this framework?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are currently employed at this courthouse as maintenance engineer, building operations." A long pause stretched across the room. Somewhere in the hallway outside, a door closed softly. The ventilation system sighed. Time moved like sludge. "That is quite a career change," the judge said carefully. It was necessary, Your Honor." "Can you elaborate?" Marcus glanced at his daughter, then back to the judge. "My wife became ill 4 years ago. Cancer. I stepped away from policy work to care for her and our daughter. After Rachel passed 18 months later, I needed work that kept me grounded. Something with clear results. A broken door gets fixed and you can see it work. Policy work, I learned, rarely offers that clarity." His voice carried no bitterness, no regret, just statement of fact. "And the framework?" Judge Moreland asked. "Did you anticipate it would be implemented as Ms. Hendricks has attempted today?" "No, Your Honor. I anticipated the safeguards I built into it would prevent exactly this. The words were not accusatory. They were simply true. And truth, Victoria was learning, could cut deeper than anger. Judge Moreland turned back to Victoria. Ms. Hendricks, I am going to ask you directly. Did the training you received cover these specific provisions? Written consent, independent advocacy, court authorization? Victoria could lie, she could deflect. She could claim the training had been comprehensive, and she had simply forgotten in the moment. But sitting across from the man who had built the very protection she had ignored, sitting in front of a daughter who looked so much like her own Emily had looked 4 years ago, she found she could not. The training emphasized efficiency, Your Honor, evidence preservation timelines, metrics for case resolution. The safeguards were mentioned but presented as flexible guidelines. Flexible guidelines. The judge repeated the phrase as though tasting something bitter. Mr. Webb, are the provisions you wrote intended to be flexible? No, Your Honor. They are requirements, legal requirements. I wrote them that way specifically to prevent compromise. Victoria felt Grace shift beside her. Her assistant had been silent throughout, but now she placed a hand briefly on the table, fingers tapping once, twice, a nervous gesture. Judge Moreland closed the binder. Ms. Hendricks, I am denying your request for evidence collection as stated. If you wish to proceed with proper authorization, you may file a written motion detailing the statutory basis, the specific evidence sought, and the safeguards you will implement. Until then, this proceeding is suspended. Victoria should have objected. She should have cited the urgency, the political pressure, the expectations from Councilman Ashford's office. But the words would not come. Your Honor, she began, but her voice felt hollow even to herself. We are adjourned for today. I want written briefs from all parties by tomorrow morning. We will reconvene then. The gavel fell, not dramatic, not theatrical, just final. As the room began to empty, Victoria sat frozen. She watched Marcus Webb place a hand on his daughter's shoulder, gentle and protective. She watched Sophie exhale, the tension draining from her frame like water from a broken dam. She watched them stand together, father and daughter, united in a way that made Victoria's chest ache. Daniel Chen approached her table after the others had left. Ms. Hendricks, I have been working here for 15 years. I have seen things that bothered me. Patterns I did not understand how to challenge. He paused. Mr. Webb just showed us how. By humiliating me? By asking questions. Daniel's voice was soft but firm. He asked for exactly what the framework requires. Written authorization, statutory basis, transparency. That is not humiliation. That is accountability. He left her there with her precisely aligned files and her hollow procedures. Victoria gathered her materials slowly, mechanically. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of packing her briefcase, but her mind was elsewhere. It was 4 years ago, in this same building, in a different room. Her daughter Emily, 18 years old then, sitting in a similar chair with similar fear in her eyes. The memory came unbidden and unwelcome. Emily had been at a party. There had been a college student, drunk and insistent. There had been an assault. Emily had reported it to the police, brave and shaking, and the machinery of justice had begun to turn. But the boy's father was a state senator, and the case had been handed to the compliance office for sensitive handling. And Victoria, new to her position and eager to prove herself competent, had done what she was told. Emily, we need the clothing you were wearing for evidence preservation. Emily, crying, asking if she could go home first, shower first, have her mother there for support. We need to preserve chain of custody. The procedure requires immediate collection. No written consent. No independent advocate. No court authorization. Just Victoria, following the training she had received, meeting the metrics she was told mattered, processing her own daughter through a system that treated trauma like a workflow. Emily had complied. She had removed her clothing in a room with strangers, shaking and crying, while Victoria stood there telling herself this was necessary. This was procedure. This was protecting her daughter from the complications of a trial. The case had been settled quietly, an NDA signed, money exchanged. Emily had gone to college across the country, and their phone calls had become shorter, cooler, until they barely spoke at all. Victoria had told herself she had done the right thing. She had protected Emily from the trauma of a public trial, from cross-examination from her name in the media. She had followed procedure. But sitting in the empty hearing room now, remembering Marcus Webb's steady voice asking for statutory basis, remembering his daughter's relief when the request was denied, Victoria felt the architecture of her self-justification begin to crack. She had not protected Emily. She had processed her. The realization sat in her chest like a stone. Victoria left the courthouse through the side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where she might encounter colleagues, or worse, Marcus Webb. The afternoon sun was too bright after the fluorescent prison of the hearing room, and she stood for a moment on the steps, blinking against the glare, disoriented by the shift from controlled interior space to the chaos of the outside world. Her car sat in the employee parking lot where she had left it that morning, when she had still been a competent compliance officer heading to a routine hearing. Now she was something else, someone who had been shown the gap between what she thought she was doing and what she was actually doing. Someone who had looked at a 16-year-old girl and seen her own daughter's face 4 years too late. She sat in her car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, staring at nothing. The dashboard clock ticked forward, 3:15, 3:30, 3:45. People came and went around her, ending their workdays, heading home to families and routines and lives that made sense. Victoria sat and felt the foundation of her own life crack beneath her. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. She ignored it until the sound became impossible to ignore, then looked at the screen with the detachment of someone watching events happen to a stranger. A text from her supervisor, Patricia Morrison. VH need debrief on Ashford case, office, 4 p.m. Another text, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Hendricks, some cases are better resolved quietly. Consider all stakeholders. A friend. Not a friend. A threat. She had been in this work long enough to recognize the difference. Victoria stared at the messages and understood with crystalline clarity what they meant. The supervisor wanted an explanation for why the case had not been resolved efficiently, why she had allowed a maintenance worker to derail what should have been a simple evidence collection, why she had not pushed back harder when Marcus Webb asked his uncomfortable questions. The unknown number wanted her to know she was being watched, that there were expectations, that her cooperation was assumed, that deviating from the script would have consequences. 4 years of this work had taught her to read between the lines, to understand that consider all stakeholders meant protect the powerful, that resolved quietly meant make problems disappear, that friend meant someone who can hurt you if you do not comply. She thought about Sophie Webb's face, pale and frightened in the hearing room. She thought about the way the girl's shoulders had curved inward, making herself small, the universal body language of people who have learned that taking up space invites punishment. She thought about Emily's face 4 years ago, wearing that same expression of confusion and betrayal when her own mother had demanded her clothing in a room full of strangers. She thought about the framework that Marcus Webb had built to protect children like them, to ensure that procedures served dignity rather than destroying it. And she thought about how thoroughly that framework had been undermined by people like her, who followed training instead of law, who prioritized metrics over mercy, who told themselves they were just doing their jobs. There was a box in her trunk. She had been meaning to throw it away for 3 years, but had never quite managed it. Every few months she would open the trunk, see the box, tell herself today was the day she would finally dispose of it, and then close the trunk again without touching it. Evidence of her failure, preserved in cardboard and tape. Victoria got out of the car, the afternoon heat hitting her like a wall after the air-conditioned interior. She opened the trunk and stared at the box marked Emily 2021 in her own handwriting, the year her daughter had been assaulted, the year Victoria had chosen procedure over protection, the year everything changed. She pulled the box out and sat on the edge of the trunk, the metal warm through her suit pants. Other cars came and went around her, courthouse employees heading home, probably talking about their days, about cases and calendars and what they were making for dinner. Normal conversations, normal lives. Victoria sat with a box of broken dreams and opened it for the first time in 18 months. Inside were the documents from Emily's case, arranged in the same meticulous order Victoria brought to all her work. The NDA, signed by both of them in different shades of ink. The settlement agreement with its clinical language about consideration and release of claims. The police report with its brutal, factual recitation of what had been done to her daughter. Photos from before, when Emily had still smiled easily, when she had still looked at her mother with trust instead of careful distance. And at the bottom, wrapped in a t-shirt that still smelled faintly of Emily's shampoo, was the journal. Victoria had found it when packing up Emily's room after she left for college. A leather-bound notebook, the kind Emily had always preferred, filled with her daughter's neat handwriting. She had known she should not read it, had known it was an invasion of privacy, had read it anyway, desperate for some understanding of the daughter who had become a stranger. Now she opened it again, hands trembling, and let it fall open to a random page, the way people do with books when they are looking for signs or meaning or absolution. The entry was dated 2 weeks after the assault. The handwriting was shaky, not Emily's usual precise script, the letters uneven in a way that suggested they had been written through tears. Victoria read the words 3 times, then 4, then lost count. Each reading was a small violence, necessary and unbearable. Her daughter's pain, documented in neat cursive, preserved in a journal that Victoria had no right to read but could not stop reading. She turned pages carefully, as though the paper might crumble under rough handling. More entries, more documentation of the aftermath. Therapy today. Dr. Chen asked me what I am most angry about. I said the assault, but that is not true. I am angry about the assault, but I am angrier about Mom. Because the boy who assaulted me, I never expected him to care about me. But Mom, I expected her to protect me, and she chose her job instead. College acceptance letters came today. I got into Berkeley. I should be excited, but all I can think about is how far away California is from Seattle. How I will not have to see Mom's face when she pretends everything is fine. How I can start over somewhere nobody knows what happened. Mom called to check in. We talked for 6 minutes. She asked about classes. I said fine. She asked about friends. I said fine. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. We have become people who say fine when nothing is fine. I do not know how to talk to her anymore. I do not know if I want to learn. The entries went on for months, a chronicle of damage that Victoria had caused and then ignored because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging her own failure. She read until the sun began to set, until the parking lot had emptied and refilled with the evening shift, until her eyes burned and her hands ached from gripping the journal too tightly. The final entry she read was dated 6 months after the assault, just before Emily left for college. I signed the NDA today. Mom said it protects me, but it feels like it protects everyone except me. The boy who assaulted me gets to go to his fancy college with no one knowing what he did. Mom gets to keep her job without anyone knowing what she did. And I get money and silence, and the knowledge that my trauma has been resolved administratively. I wonder if this is what justice feels like. If so, I want no part of it. Victoria closed the journal carefully and sat with it in her lap as the light faded from the sky. She had read these words before, 18 months ago, and had closed the journal and put it back in the box, and told herself that Emily was young, that she was processing trauma, that she would understand eventually that Victoria had done what was necessary. But now, sitting in a parking lot after watching herself almost violate another child the same way she had violated her own daughter, Victoria understood that Emily had been right. The NDA had not protected her. The settlement had not healed her. The procedure had not served justice. It had served convenience. It had served efficiency. It had served Victoria's career and the boy's family's reputation and the compliance office's metrics. But it had not served Emily. Her phone rang, Emily's number. Victoria's hand shook as she answered. For 3 years, calls from Emily had been brief and surface level. Weather, classes, logistics, conversations that carefully avoided anything real, anything that might crack the fragile peace they had constructed from silence and avoidance. Honey? Mom. Emily's voice was cautious in the way it had been for 3 years, the tone of someone approaching something dangerous that might explode if handled roughly. I saw something on the news about a hearing at the courthouse, about compliance violations. Was that you? Victoria had not realized the news would cover it so quickly. Of course they would. Councilman Ashford's son was involved. Political families always attracted media attention. Yes. What happened? The question was careful, neutral, giving nothing away about what Emily felt or thought or needed. Victoria took a breath. She could minimize it. She could say it was a routine hearing that got complicated, that it would be resolved soon, that Emily should not worry. She could protect herself the way she had been protecting herself for years, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine when nothing was fine. Or she could choose differently. I tried to do to another girl what I did to you. Her father stopped me. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Victoria wondered if the call had dropped. Then Emily's voice, quieter than before, carrying weight that had not been there moments ago. Tell me what happened. So Victoria did. She told Emily about Sophie Webb, about the blood-stained hoodie, about the demand for clothing removal. She told her about Marcus Webb asking questions she could not answer, about the framework being pulled out and read aloud, about realizing in real time that she was about to traumatize another child the same way she had traumatized her own daughter. He stopped me, Victoria said, and her voice broke on the words. This man I barely knew, this maintenance worker who used to be someone important, he stopped me from doing to his daughter what I did to you. And I am so sorry. I have been sorry for 3 years, but I did not know how to say it. I did not know how to fix it. You cannot fix it, Mom. Emily's voice was steady in the way that comes from having said something many times in therapy, from having processed the unfixable until you can speak about it without falling apart. You cannot give me back what I lost. I know. Do you? Emily's voice carried an edge now, anger that had been buried for 3 years finding its way to the surface. Do you know what you took from me? It was not just the assault, Mom. That boy, that horrible night, I could have survived that. But you, my own mother, you made me strip in a room full of strangers. You told me it was necessary. You made me sign papers that said I could never talk about it. You took my trauma and you processed it like paperwork. Victoria closed her eyes. I know. And then you just moved on, like it had not happened, like we were fine. Emily's voice was shaking now. I went to California. I barely spoke to you for 3 years. And you never once asked me why. You never once acknowledged what you did. I told myself I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. The words were sharp enough to cut. You were protecting your job, your reputation, your ability to tell yourself you were a good person following procedure. Victoria sat in her car in the darkening parking lot and took the words like blows, each one deserved, each one a small payment on a debt she could never fully repay. You are right. I was protecting myself. I was too afraid to admit I had failed you. So I told myself I had done what was necessary and I moved on, and I left you alone with the consequences. She heard Emily crying now, soft sounds that broke something in Victoria's chest. But Victoria's voice was steady despite the tears running down her own face. But you can stop doing it to other people. Can you do that? The question sat between them, heavy with implications. Emily was asking if Victoria could become someone different than who she had been, if change was possible, if a person who had chosen wrong could choose right. Victoria looked at the box in her trunk, at the courthouse building behind her, at the choice that sat before her like a crossroads. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had walked away from power to fix doors because at least then he could see the results of his work. She thought about Sophie, who had a father willing to stand between her and institutional cruelty. She thought about Rachel Webb's epitaph that she had seen in the newspaper when researching the case. She fought for those who could not fight for themselves. I can try, Victoria said. Trying is not enough. Emily's voice was fierce now, not angry, but determined. I need to know you mean it, that you are not just going to do this until it gets hard, and then go back to protecting yourself. I mean it. I am writing a brief tonight, confessing to everything, the violations in your case and every other case I handled the same way. I am going to expose the training that taught me to ignore the framework. I am going to testify publicly about what I did. Silence again, but different this time. Thoughtful rather than hurt. Mom, if you do that, you will lose your job. I know. They will sue us over the NDA. I know. Your career will be over. I know. Victoria wiped her eyes. But Emily, I cannot keep doing this. I cannot keep being the person who processes traumatized children and calls it procedure. I looked at that girl today, and I saw you. and I finally understood what I did, what I have been doing for 4 years, while telling myself I was just following orders. Then try, Mom. Emily's voice was softer now, carrying something that might have been hope, or might have been just exhaustion from carrying anger for so long. Please try. For me, for that girl, for all the others. I will. And Mom? Emily's voice caught. Thank you for finally seeing it, for finally choosing me over the job. I know that does not fix anything, but it matters. I love you, sweetheart. I love you too. Emily paused. Call me tomorrow, after you send the brief. I want to know you actually did it. I will. The call ended. Victoria sat with the phone in her hand, with the box of Emily's broken dreams in her trunk, with the weight of 4 years of choices pressing down on her shoulders, with the first fragile threads of hope that maybe, possibly, she could become someone her daughter could be proud of, instead of someone her daughter had learned to avoid. There was an email on her phone. From Judge Moreland's chambers, a notice that a formal review hearing had been scheduled for the following week. Public docket. Media access granted. All parties required to testify under oath about compliance procedures and framework implementation. Victoria opened her work email and began to type. Your Honor, I am writing to request permission to submit additional testimony regarding systematic violations of the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework. I have evidence spanning multiple years and multiple cases. I am prepared to testify fully and completely about these violations, including those in which I personally participated. Respectfully, Victoria Hendricks. Her finger hovered over the send button. Sending this email would end her career. It would expose the training she had received, the pressure she had been under, the metrics she had been told to meet. It would implicate her supervisors, her colleagues, perhaps even judges who had looked the other way. It would cost her everything she had built over 20 years. But not sending it would cost her something she had already lost once and could not afford to lose again. Her daughter's respect, her own integrity, the ability to look at herself in the mirror and see someone worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. Victoria thought about Marcus Webb, who had walked away from a senior policy position to fix door hinges, because at least then he could see the results of his work. She thought about Sophie, who had a father willing to stand between her and a system that wanted to treat her as evidence instead of as a person. She thought about Emily, asking her mother to try. She pressed send. The email disappeared into the digital void. No taking it back now. No protecting herself. Just truth. Released like a bird from a cage, free to fly where it would. Victoria closed her laptop and started the car. She needed to go home. She needed to call Emily back. She needed to prepare for whatever came next. But first, she drove to the cemetery on the edge of the city, the one with the old oak trees and the quiet paths where people came to remember. She parked and walked to a section she had visited only once before, 3 years ago, for the funeral of a woman she had never met, but whose husband now worked in her building. Rachel Webb's grave was simple, a flat granite marker with her name, her dates, and a single line. She fought for those who could not fight for themselves. Victoria stood there for a long time, reading that epitaph over and over. Rachel had been a social worker. Marcus had mentioned it once in passing, in a conversation Victoria had only half listened to because maintenance workers were background noise in her world. Rachel had fought for those who could not fight for themselves, and her husband had built a framework to continue that fight after her illness forced her to stop. And Victoria had spent 4 years undermining that framework, while telling herself she was just following procedure. She thought about the kind of person Rachel must have been. The kind of person who married someone like Marcus, who raised a daughter like Sophie. The kind of person whose last wish, judging by the epitaph, was to be remembered for her advocacy. I am sorry, Victoria said to the gravestone, to the memory of a woman she had never known. I am sorry I failed to honor what you and your husband built. I am going to try to fix it now. The words felt inadequate and necessary at the same time. Victoria drove home slowly, letting the evening traffic flow around her. Her apartment was small and neat, decorated with photos of Emily at various ages. Graduation pictures, vacation photos, a framed drawing from elementary school, evidence of a relationship that had been damaged but not destroyed. She made tea and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open. The brief for tomorrow's preliminary hearing needed to be written. Judge Moreland wanted statutory citations, procedural history, detailed explanations. Victoria could write the standard response, cite training materials, claim good faith reliance on supervisory guidance, minimize the violations. Or she could write the truth. She began to type, and this time the words came easily. Your Honor, I have served as Chief Compliance Officer for 4 years. During that time, I have systematically violated the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework. I did this not out of malice, but out of adherence to training that prioritized efficiency over safeguards, metrics over dignity, and political considerations over child protection. The words flowed like water from a broken dam. I was trained to view the framework's safeguards as flexible guidelines rather than legal requirements. I was incentivized through performance bonuses to meet prosecution targets. I was pressured by powerful families to resolve cases quickly and quietly, and I complied. She wrote about the cases she now knew had similar violations. She wrote about the pattern of targeting families without resources to fight back. She wrote about the training materials that contradicted the framework while claiming to implement it. And then, because truth demanded completeness, she wrote about Emily. 4 years ago, my own daughter was assaulted. As Chief Compliance Officer, I personally violated the framework in her case. I collected evidence without written consent, without independent advocacy, without court authorization. I told myself I was protecting her. I was protecting myself. And in doing so, I traumatized her almost as much as the assault itself had. Victoria's hands were shaking, but she kept typing. I cannot undo what I did to my daughter or to the other children who passed through this system, but I can ensure it does not continue. I am prepared to testify fully about these violations and to cooperate completely with any investigation into the systematic corruption of the framework. She finished the brief at 11:30 that night, 23 pages, single-spaced, with exhibits documenting training materials, incentive structures, and case outcomes. Before she could second-guess herself, she attached it to an email to Judge Moreland's chambers and pressed send. Then she called Emily. Mom, it's late. Are you okay? I am scared, Victoria said, her voice breaking. I just did something that is going to change everything, and I am terrified. What did you do? I told the truth, all of it. About the system, about the training, about you, about what I did to you. Silence. Then Emily's voice, softer than Victoria had heard it in years. Thank you, Mom. I know that cost you. It is going to cost more before this is done. I will probably lose my job. We might get sued over the NDA. Your privacy, your story, it might all become public. Mom? Emily's voice was steady. I have been living with the silence for 3 years. It has not protected me. It has isolated me. If my story helps other girls, then tell it. Tell all of it. Victoria wiped her eyes. I love you, sweetheart. I love you too, Mom. And I am proud of you. The words hit Victoria harder than any judgment could have. Proud. Emily was proud of her. After they hung up, Victoria sat in her quiet apartment and felt the weight of the choice she had made settle over her like a blanket. Heavy but not suffocating, present but not crushing. She had chosen truth over career, integrity over security, her daughter over her job. For the first time in 4 years, Victoria Hendricks slept soundly. She woke to her phone ringing at 6 a.m. Judge Moreland's clerk. Ms. Hendricks, the judge has reviewed your brief. She would like to see you in chambers at 8 a.m. Please come alone. Victoria arrived at the courthouse early. The building felt different in the morning light, less institutional, more human. She saw Marcus Webb in the hallway, already at work despite the early hour, replacing a ceiling tile that had been water damaged. He noticed her and nodded once, no words needed, just acknowledgement between two people who had chosen the harder path. Judge Moreland's chambers were lined with law books and case files, the accumulated wisdom of decades on the bench. The judge sat behind her desk, Victoria's brief open before her, reading glasses perched on her nose. Sit down, Ms. Hendricks. Victoria sat. I read your brief, all 23 pages, every exhibit. Yes, Your Honor. This is quite possibly the most damning self-incrimination I have seen in 25 years as a judge. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Moreland removed her glasses and looked at Victoria directly. Why did you write it? Because it is true. And because I have a daughter who deserves a mother with integrity. The judge nodded slowly. You understand that by testifying about these violations, you are ending your career in this field? Yes, Your Honor. You understand that powerful people will try to discredit you, to silence you, perhaps even to prosecute you? Yes, Your Honor. And you are willing to proceed anyway? Victoria thought about Emily, about Sophie Webb, about Rachel Webb's epitaph, about all the children whose dignity had been sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. Yes, Your Honor, I am willing. Judge Moreland leaned back in her chair. Ms. Hendricks, I implemented the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework in this district 7 years ago because I believed in what Marcus Webb built. I believed that we could create a system that protected children instead of processing them. Your brief demonstrates how thoroughly we failed. I failed, Your Honor. We all failed, but you are the first person with the courage to say so publicly. The judge closed the brief. Next week's hearing is going to change everything. Are you prepared for that? No, Your Honor, but I am going to do it anyway. A small smile crossed the judge's face. Good, because this district, this courthouse, this entire system needs to be held accountable. And you have just lit the match. Victoria left chambers feeling lighter than she had in years. The truth was out. The consequences would come, but she had chosen correctly this time. She was finally, after 4 years of failure, the mother Emily deserved. And that mattered more than anything else. Victoria Hendricks woke at 5:30 in the morning to the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. The sky outside her apartment window was still dark. The city of Seattle wrapped in that particular silence that comes just before dawn. She had slept deeply for the first time in years, the kind of sleep that comes after a decision has been made and cannot be unmade. The phone showed 47 missed calls, 89 unread emails, text messages stacking up like accusations. She ignored them all and made coffee instead. The ritual of grinding beans, measuring water, waiting for the machine to hiss and gurgle gave her hands something to do, while her mind processed what she had set in motion. The apartment was small but carefully maintained, filled with photographs of Emily at various stages of growing up, birthday parties, school plays, volleyball tournaments, a visual history of motherhood that had fractured 4 years ago and never quite healed. Victoria carried her coffee to the window and watched the city wake, streetlights beginning to dim, early commuters heading to buses and trains, the ordinary machinery of life continuing while her own world prepared to collapse. The first call she answered was Emily. Mom. Her daughter's voice was thick with sleep and worry. Mom, the news is reporting something. They are saying you filed a complaint against your own office. They are saying you are involving your case, my case. Victoria closed her eyes. Of course the media had already found it. Court documents were public record. Reporters monitored dockets for exactly this kind of story. She had known this would happen. Knowing did not make it easier. I had to tell the truth, sweetheart. But the NDA! Emily's voice cracked. Mom, we signed agreements. They can sue us. They will sue us. I know. Then why did you do it? Victoria looked at the photograph closest to her, Emily at 16, smiling with her whole face in a way she had not smiled since the assault, since the compliance office, since her own mother had chosen procedure over protection. Because I looked at that girl yesterday, Sophie Webb, and I saw you. And I realized I have been protecting myself for 4 years while you suffered alone. That ends today. The line was quiet except for the sound of Emily breathing, the small hitches that meant she was crying. I am so sorry. I am sorry I did not protect you then. I am sorry I made you sign that NDA. I am sorry I chose my career over you. Mom! Emily's voice was barely a whisper. I have been waiting so long to hear you say that. I know, I should have said it years ago. What happens now? Victoria took a sip of coffee. It had gone cold, but she drank it anyway. Now I face the consequences, and you get to choose whether you want to be part of this or not. Your story is yours, Emily. I will not make decisions about it for you anymore. I want to come home. The words hit Victoria in the chest. Home. Emily had not called Seattle home in 3 years. She had stayed in California for college, found internships that kept her there over summers, built a life that did not include her mother, except for brief, careful phone calls on holidays. When? Today. I am getting on a plane this morning. I will be there by afternoon. Emily, you do not have to do this. You do not have to be involved in any of this. Yes, I do, Mom. You chose me, finally. Now I am choosing us. After they hung up, Victoria sat with the phone in her lap and let herself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she had allowed herself over the years, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place she had kept locked away, because opening it would have meant admitting how badly she had failed. The coffee grew colder. The sun came up, and Victoria Hendricks prepared to walk into the courthouse and face what she had done. The building felt different as she approached it that morning. The same concrete and glass structure she had entered 5 days a week for 4 years. But now it loomed with a kind of hostile weight. She used her badge to enter through the employee entrance, avoiding the main lobby where reporters might be waiting. The hallways were familiar territory. She knew every turn, every office, every courtroom. But the people who populated those spaces looked at her differently now. Colleagues who had smiled and made small talk about weekend plans now found reasons to look at their phones when she passed. The whispers started before she was out of earshot. Grace Martinez, her assistant, stood outside Victoria's office door. She looked like she had been waiting, her arms crossed, her expression caught between concern and something else Victoria could not quite identify. "They want to see you," Grace said quietly. "Morrison's office, 8 a.m. sharp." Victoria checked her watch, 7:45. "Grace, I need you to know that whatever happens, you were not part of this. You did not know about the complaint. I knew the compliance office was violating the framework." Grace's voice was steadier than Victoria expected. "I have known for 2 years. I documented it, and I said nothing because I was afraid." She pulled a USB drive from her pocket and pressed it into Victoria's hand. "Cases, files, evidence, everything I saw but was too scared to report. If you are going to burn this place down, use this to make sure it burns completely." Victoria closed her fingers around the small device. "Grace, they will fire you." "Probably, but I will still be able to look at myself in the mirror." Grace met her eyes. "Thank you for being braver than I was." Patricia Morrison's office was on the 3rd floor, corner suite with windows overlooking the city. Morrison herself was 60 years old, a career bureaucrat who had survived 4 different administrations by mastering the art of never taking a position that could not be walked back later. She sat behind her desk with the kind of rigid posture that came from decades of holding herself above the fray. 2 other people waited in the office. A man Victoria recognized as Harold Chen from the State Attorney General's office, and a woman she did not know, expensive suit and briefcase that marked her as private counsel. "Sit down, Victoria." Morrison's voice was clipped, professional, empty of warmth. Victoria sat. "What have you done?" "I filed a complaint about systematic violations of the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework. I submitted evidence documenting those violations over a 4-year period. And I informed Judge Moreland that I am prepared to testify fully about my own participation in those violations." Morrison's jaw tightened. "You accuse this office of corruption." "I accuse this office of violating legal safeguards designed to protect children. Corruption is your word, not mine. You implicated yourself. You admitted to misconduct in your own daughter's case." "Yes. Do you understand what you have done? Your career is over. Your pension is at risk. You have exposed yourself to civil liability, potentially criminal liability. And for what? To make yourself feel better about choices you made years ago?" Victoria thought about Emily's voice on the phone that morning, about Sophie Webb's frightened eyes in the hearing room, about the 47 other cases documented on the USB drive in her pocket. "I did it because it was true, and because someone needed to say it out loud." The lawyer spoke for the first time, her voice smooth and practiced. "Ms. Hendricks, I represent several families who signed non-disclosure agreements in cases you handled. By filing this complaint, by referencing your daughter's case, you have violated those agreements. My clients are prepared to pursue damages." "I understand. The damages could be substantial, hundreds of thousands of dollars." "I understand." Morrison leaned forward. "Victoria, you still have a choice here. Withdraw the complaint. Claim it was filed in error, that you were emotionally compromised, that you have reconsidered. We can manage this quietly. Protect you. Protect the office." "And the violations, the children who were processed through a system that ignored their rights?" "Ancient history. Cases that were resolved years ago." Victoria stood. "I am not withdrawing the complaint, and I am not protecting this office anymore." "Then you are suspended, effective immediately, pending investigation." Morrison's face was stone. "Security will escort you from the building. You have 30 minutes to clear your desk." Victoria had expected this. She had prepared for it, but hearing the words still felt like a blow. 20 years of work, of building a career, of climbing through the ranks, ended in a sentence. She cleared her desk in silence while a security officer stood in the doorway. "Personal items only. Photographs of Emily, a coffee mug, a small plant that had somehow survived 4 years in fluorescent light. Everything else belonged to the office, to the system, to the machinery she had served faithfully until yesterday. As she was being escorted out, she saw Marcus Webb in the hallway. He was replacing a broken light fixture, standing on a ladder with tools clipped to his belt. He looked down as she passed, and their eyes met. He nodded once, no pity in the gesture, no judgment. Just acknowledgement that they were both on the same side of a line that most people never had to see. Victoria waited at the coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse. She had texted Marcus from the parking lot, asking if he would meet her when his shift ended. She half expected him to decline, to want nothing to do with the woman who had tried to violate his daughter's dignity just 2 days ago. He arrived at 10:15, still in his work clothes, carrying a thermos of what she guessed was coffee he had made at home. He sat across from her in the booth and waited for her to speak first. "Mr. Webb, I owe you and your daughter an apology." "You filed the complaint. That is more than an apology." "It is a start, but I need help. I do not know how to fight this system. You built it. You understand it in ways I never did." Marcus unscrewed his thermos and poured coffee into the lid. The steam rose between them. "Why the change? 2 days ago you were following orders." Victoria had known this question was coming. She had practiced answers in her head, tried to find words that would make sense of the past 4 years and the decision she had finally made. But sitting across from the man whose framework she had corrupted, whose daughter she had tried to humiliate with procedure, the practiced words felt hollow. "4 years ago, I did to my daughter what I almost did to yours. She was assaulted at a party. The compliance office, my office, took over the kid. I was new to the job, eager to prove myself, and I followed the training I had been given." She told him about Emily, about the demand for clothing without consent or advocacy, about the NDA and the settlement and the 3 years of silence that had followed. Her voice stayed steady, but her hands shook around her coffee cup. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took a slow drink from his thermos. The framework was designed to prevent exactly that. Someone trained you to ignore it. Someone systematic. "I have evidence." She pulled out Grace's USB drive. 47 cases over 4 years, all with similar violations, all involving families who could not fight back. Marcus took the drive, turned it over in his calloused hands. "This is bigger than I thought." "There is more. The Zero Tolerance Initiative that funds our office. It is not just about compliance metrics. It is funded by private prison contractors, by political action committees focused on tough-on-crime messaging. They created financial incentives for aggressive prosecution of juveniles." She showed him the documents she had compiled, the funding streams, the performance bonuses tied to prosecution rates, the political pressure from families like the Ashfords who wanted cases resolved in their favor. Marcus read through the papers with the careful attention of someone who understood that details mattered. "They weaponized my framework, used the structure I built to protect children as a tool to process them instead. I was the weapon. And I am sorry." He looked up from the documents. "You cannot undo the past, Ms. Hendricks, but we can prevent the future." "Victoria, please." "Victoria." He said her name carefully, as though testing its weight. "The hearing next week is public. Judge Moreland is serious about transparency. If we can connect the funding structures to the violations, if we can show this was systematic and deliberate, we can force real change. My daughter is still facing charges. The system is still broken. And I wrote the framework that was supposed to prevent this." He closed the folder of documents. "We have a shared interest in fixing it." They spent the next 2 hours planning. Victoria had the insider knowledge of how the compliance office operated, who made decisions, where pressure came from. Marcus had the legal expertise and the moral authority of being the framework's architect. Together, they mapped out a strategy for the hearing. But Victoria's mind kept drifting to the airport, to Emily's flight that would land in 3 hours, to the reunion that terrified her more than any hearing. Marcus noticed. "You are distracted. My daughter is coming home. I have not seen her in 6 months." "That is good." "I am afraid she will look at me and still see the woman who failed her." Marcus packed his thermos away carefully. "Then show her someone different. Show her the woman who is trying to fix it." Victoria picked Emily up from the airport at 2:15. She waited at the arrivals curb, watching passengers stream out with their luggage and their lives. And then Emily was there. 22 years old now, taller than Victoria remembered, her hair longer, her face carrying the kind of careful guardedness that comes from protecting yourself against people you should be able to trust. They stood looking at each other across 3 feet of sidewalk and 4 years of damage. Emily moved first. She dropped her bag and stepped into her mother's arms, and Victoria held her daughter the way she should have held her 4 years ago when Emily had needed her most. They cried there on the curb while taxis honked and travelers flowed around them, and the world continued spinning. "I am so sorry," Victoria whispered into Emily's hair. "I am so sorry." "I know, Mom, I know." The drive back to Victoria's apartment took them through neighborhoods that held memories. Past the elementary school where Emily had learned to read, past the park where she had played soccer on Saturday mornings, past the ice cream shop where they had celebrated good report cards and volleyball victories. Every block was a reminder of the relationship that had existed before, the easy closeness that Victoria had taken for granted until it was gone. Emily sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the city she had left behind, familiar streets made strange by absence. Her fingers traced patterns on the window glass, a nervous habit she had developed as a child. Victoria remembered holding that hand when it was small enough to disappear completely in her own palm, guiding her daughter across streets and through crowds, keeping her safe from traffic and strangers, and all the visible dangers of the world. She had protected Emily from strangers, but she had failed to protect her from the system, from procedure, from her own mother's choices. Victoria wanted to fill the silence with explanations, with justifications, with all the words she had rehearsed over the years. She wanted to explain about the pressure at work, about being new to the job, about the training that had emphasized efficiency over everything else. But Emily's presence felt too fragile for that, like a bird that might startle and fly away if approached too quickly. So instead, she drove in silence and let the city speak for them, each landmark a shared memory that had not been completely destroyed by what came after. By what? At the apartment, Emily stood in the doorway of her old room. Victoria had left it mostly untouched, a shrine to the daughter who had lived there before everything changed. Volleyball trophies on the shelf, posters of bands Emily had loved in high school, a bulletin board still covered in photos of friends and teammates. "It looks the same," Emily said softly. "I could not bring myself to change it. I kept hoping you would come back." Victoria felt the words like physical blows, but forced herself to listen, to not defend, to not explain away. "The assault was something done to me by someone I barely knew. But you were my mother. You were supposed to protect me. And instead, you made me part of a procedure." Emily's voice cracked. "I was not a person to you that night. I was a case." "You are right. For 3 years, I have been in therapy trying to understand why. Trying to figure out if you ever really loved me or if I was always just another responsibility you managed." "Emily." Victoria took a step forward but stopped when Emily tensed. "I loved you. I love you. But I failed you in the worst possible way. I chose my job over you. I chose following orders over protecting you. I chose silence over standing up." She sat down on Emily's old bed, the mattress sagging under her weight. "I cannot give you those 3 years back. I cannot undo what I did or make the trauma disappear. But I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my life making sure no other mother makes the choice I made." Emily wiped her eyes. "Why now, Mom? Why Sophie Webb and not me?" Victoria had asked herself this question 100 times in the past 2 days. "Because I was a coward 4 years ago. I was new to the job, afraid to make waves, terrified of losing my career. I told myself I was protecting you by following procedure, but I was protecting myself." "What changed?" "I saw her, Sophie, and I saw you. And I realized I had been protecting myself for 4 years while you lived with the consequences. I cannot live with that anymore." Emily sat down beside her mother on the bed, not touching, but close enough that Victoria could feel the warmth of her presence. "What happens now?" "I testify. I expose everything, the violations, the funding structures, the political pressure. My career ends. We probably get sued over breaking the NDA. Your privacy, your story, it might all become public. And you are willing to do that. If you will let me. This is your story, Emily. I will not make decisions about it for you ever again." Emily stared at her hands, at the fingers she twisted together the way she had as a child when she was nervous. "For 3 years I have been silent, The NDA, the settlement money, all of it was supposed to protect me. But it just isolated me, made me feel like what happened was shameful, something to hide. She looked up at Victoria. If my story helps other girls, if it stops the system from doing to them what it did to me, then tell it. Tell all of it. Victoria felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. Thank you. But Mom, Emily's voice was fierce now. You have to see this through. You cannot start this and then back down when it gets hard. Because if you do, if you let them silence you again, I do not think I can forgive you a second time. I will see it through, I promise. They sat together on the bed in the room that held memories of a simpler time, and Victoria felt the first tentative threads of reconnection begin to form. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. That evening, Victoria made dinner while Emily unpacked. The simple domesticity of chopping vegetables and setting the table felt surreal after years of careful distance. They ate together at the small kitchen table and talked about safe things. Emily's classes, her apartment in California, friends Victoria had never met. After dinner, Emily helped wash dishes and then pulled out her laptop. Mom, can I see the complaint you filed? Victoria pulled up the document on her computer and turned the screen toward her daughter. Emily read in silence, her face moving through expressions Victoria could not quite interpret. Surprise, anger, sadness, something that might have been pride. You wrote about me, about what you did. I could not ask other people to tell their truth if I was not willing to tell mine. Emily scrolled through the pages of documentation. This is a lot of evidence. Grace, my assistant, had been documenting violations for 2 years. She gave me everything. And you are going to testify about all of this publicly? Next week, open hearing, media access. Emily closed the laptop and looked at her mother with an intensity that made Victoria want to look away. I want to testify too. Emily, no, you do not have to do that. Yes, I do. You filed the complaint. You are breaking the NDA. But this is my story. I should be the one to tell it. Sweetheart, it will be public. Your name will be in the news. People will ask questions, make judgments. Let them. Emily's voice was steady. I have been ashamed for 3 years. Ashamed of what happened to me. Ashamed of how the system treated me. Ashamed that my own mother chose procedure over protecting me. I am done being ashamed. Victoria saw in her daughter's face something she had not seen in years. Determination. Strength. The Emily she remembered from before, who had been team captain and honor student and fierce in her convictions. Are you sure? I am sure we do this together. They stayed up late that night, Emily adding her testimony to the documentation Victoria had compiled. Where Victoria's writing was clinical and procedural, Emily's was raw and emotional. She wrote about the assault and the aftermath, about her mother demanding her clothing in a room full of strangers, about signing the NDA with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. The process of writing it all down seemed to unlock something in Emily. She talked while she typed, narrating the memories that had been sealed behind the non-disclosure agreement for 3 years. Victoria listened without interrupting, bearing witness to pain she had helped create. Emily wrote about the party where it happened. A friend's older brother, home from college, charming and confident, in the way that young men with money and connections often are. How he had offered to show her the upstairs game room, how the door had locked behind them, how her no had meant nothing to him. She wrote about the aftermath, the police interview where she had to describe everything in clinical detail, the rape kit examination that had felt like another violation, the way her friends at school had looked at her differently after, some with pity, some with skepticism, some with the kind of prurient curiosity that made her want to hide. And then she wrote about the compliance office, about her mother, who should have been her advocate, instead becoming another bureaucratic obstacle to navigate. You told me it was procedure, Emily said, still typing. You said the clothing had to be collected immediately or the evidence would be compromised. You made it sound like if I did not comply right then, right that moment, the case would fall apart. Victoria remembered saying those words, remembered believing them because her training had taught her they were true. But Mom, I had already given samples at the hospital. The rape kit was already done. Taking my clothes in your office was not about evidence preservation. It was about control, about showing me that the system had power over my body even after the assault was over. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She had thought she was following procedure. She had thought she was protecting the integrity of the case. She had never considered that she was extending the trauma, using her position to force compliance, in the same way the assailant had used physical force. Emily wrote about the 3 years since, about panic attacks triggered by official-looking documents, about the way she flinched when her mother called because every interaction felt like walking on broken glass, about changing her major from criminal justice, the career she had dreamed of since middle school, because she could not imagine working in a system that had treated her the way it did. She wrote about therapy sessions, where she tried to untangle her feelings about her mother, the woman who had raised her with love and attention for 18 years, who had cheered at every volleyball game and helped with every science project, who had somehow become a stranger in a compliance office choosing procedure over protection. And she wrote about the phone call that morning when her mother had finally chosen her. "I did not think you would ever say it," Emily typed. "I had convinced myself that you would protect your career forever, that I would always be less important than your job. When you called and told me you were breaking the NDA, that you were willing to lose everything to tell the truth, I cried for an hour." Victoria read the words through tears that blurred the screen. This is so powerful." "It is true. And I am tired of pretending it did not happen." Emily saved the document and looked at her mother. "For 3 years I have been carrying this alone. The shame, the anger, the confusion about why my own mother could not protect me. Writing it down, knowing that it will be public, that other people will read it and maybe understand what happens when systems fail. It feels like I can finally put some of it down." At 11:30 that night, Victoria's phone buzzed with a call from Daniel Chen, the court clerk who had discovered the framework violation in the first hearing. "Ms. Hendricks, I hope I am not calling too late." "It is fine, Daniel. What can I do for you?" "I have been going through case files like you asked, looking for patterns, and I found something you need to see." His voice carried an urgency that made Victoria sit up straighter. The Zero Tolerance Initiative funding. It did not just start 4 years ago when you were hired. It goes back 7 years. 7 years? But the framework was only implemented 7 years ago. Exactly. Ms. Hendricks, I think the funding was set up before the framework was even finalized. I think someone planned this from the beginning. Victoria felt ice settle in her stomach. Planned what? To corrupt the implementation, to create the appearance of child protection, while actually building a pipeline into the juvenile justice system. And I think I know who orchestrated it. Who? Dr. James Kirkland. He was on the committee that approved framework implementation. He helped write the training materials for compliance officers. And his consulting firm, the one that created the Zero Tolerance Initiative, has been receiving payments from private prison contractors since before you were hired. Victoria remembered her job interview, the panel of serious faces asking questions about her management style, her ability to follow directives, her thoughts on efficiency in juvenile justice. Dr. Kirkland had been there, had asked most of the questions, had nodded approvingly when she gave the answers he wanted to hear. She had been selected not despite her willingness to follow orders, but because of it. Daniel, can you document this, trace the funding sources, the committee appointments, the timeline of when things were set up? Already started. But Ms. Hendricks, if this goes public, if we can prove Kirkland deliberately corrupted the framework implementation, this becomes bigger than our district. He is the state policy director now. He is testifying before Congress next month about juvenile justice reform. What is he testifying about? About using the Seattle pilot program as a model for national implementation. About how the Zero Tolerance Initiative has improved outcomes and should be franchised to other states. Victoria looked at Emily, who had been listening to the one-sided conversation with growing alarm. He is going to nationalize it, take the corrupted version and spread it everywhere. Unless we stop him at the hearing next week. After Daniel hung up, Victoria and Emily sat in silence. The scope of what they were facing had just expanded beyond a single courthouse, beyond even Seattle, into something that could affect children across the entire country. "Mom," Emily said quietly, "this is bigger than us." "I know. We have to do this. We have to stop him." "I know that too." Victoria pulled up her email and began typing a message to Marcus Webb. He needed to know that his framework had been deliberately sabotaged from the beginning. that the man who had helped implement it was the same man who had corrupted it. Before she could send it, a new email arrived from an unknown address, no subject line. Ms. Hendricks, withdraw your complaint. You have 24 hours. This is not a request. Attached was a file. Victoria opened it with hands that had started to shake. It was a lawsuit, filed that evening, breach of non-disclosure agreement, $500,000 in damages. Named defendants, Victoria Hendricks and Emily Hendricks. Emily read over her mother's shoulder. They are suing me too? They are trying to scare us, make us too afraid to testify. Is it working? Victoria looked at her daughter, at the young woman who had survived assault and institutional betrayal and 3 years of isolation, at the girl who had chosen to come home and fight instead of staying safe in California. No, it is not working. She typed a response to the anonymous email. See you in court. Sent it. Then she called her attorney, the one from the advocacy group who had agreed to represent her pro bono. Left a voicemail about the lawsuit, about the threats, about everything that was escalating faster than she had anticipated. Emily made tea while Victoria sat at the kitchen table and tried to calculate the financial devastation they were facing. $500,000 in NDA damages, legal fees for defense, loss of income from her job. Her savings totaled maybe $12,000, not nearly enough. Mom, Emily set a cup of tea in front of her. I have some money saved from my job and my loans. It is yours. No, this is my fight. You should not have to pay for my mistakes. It is our fight now. We are in this together. A knock on the door at 9:30 at night made them both jump. Victoria looked through the peephole and saw Marcus Webb standing in the hallway, still in his work clothes. She opened the door. Marcus, is everything okay? Is Sophie all right? Sophie is fine. May I come in? Victoria stepped aside and let him enter. He nodded to Emily, acknowledging her presence with the same quiet courtesy he had shown to everyone. I heard about the lawsuit, he said without preamble. News travels fast in courthouse circles. That was quick. I have something for you. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Victoria. This is not charity. This is investment. Victoria opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. Marcus, I cannot accept this. It is Rachel's life insurance, my wife. She died 3 years ago. I have been holding on to this money, waiting for something worth spending it on. This is worth it. I cannot take your wife's insurance money. Rachel believed in fighting for people who could not fight for themselves. She worked as a social worker for 20 years. She saw what happened when systems failed children. If she were here, she would write this check herself. He looked at Emily. Your daughter is brave. Your fight is worth supporting. Victoria felt tears threatening again. Thank you. Next week we expose everything. The funding, the training, the deliberate corruption of the framework. We make sure Kirkland cannot do this anywhere else. He turned to leave, then paused. Victoria, you made a terrible choice 4 years ago, but you are making the right choice now. That matters. After he left, Victoria and Emily sat together on the couch. The tea had gone cold, but neither of them moved to reheat it. Mom, are you scared? Terrified. But I am more scared of doing nothing. Emily took her mother's hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact in 3 years. Whatever happens, we face it together. Victoria's phone buzzed again, another email from the unknown sender. This is your last warning, Ms. Hendricks. Withdraw or face consequences beyond litigation. We will destroy you. We will destroy your daughter. Walk away. Victoria showed it to Emily. What are you going to do? Victoria thought about the 47 children documented in Grace's files. She thought about Sophie Webb and the 6 other girls Tyler Ashford had harassed. She thought about all the children who would be processed through a corrupted system if Kirkland's national expansion succeeded. She opened her laptop and began to type. To Dr. James Kirkland, I received your threats. I will not be withdrawing my complaint. I will not be silenced, and I will not let you corrupt Marcus Webb's framework in districts across this country the way you corrupted it here. See you at the hearing. Victoria Hendricks. She showed Emily before sending it. Are you sure, Mom? Victoria thought about the question. Was she sure? No. She was terrified. But certainty and rightness were not the same thing. I am sure. She pressed send. Emily squeezed her hand. I am proud of you, Mom. Those words, the ones Victoria had been waiting 4 years to hear, broke something open in her chest. Not the careful, controlled emotion she had maintained for so long, but raw feeling that could not be contained or managed or processed through procedure. She cried, and Emily held her. And for the first time in 4 years, Victoria Hendricks felt like a mother instead of a compliance officer. They stayed up until after midnight, preparing testimony and documents, calling the advocacy group attorney to report the threats, mapping out the strategy for the hearing. The work was overwhelming, and the stakes were impossible, but they were doing it together. At 12:30, Emily finally went to bed in her old room. Victoria sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop and the weight of everything she had set in motion. Another email arrived, this one from Judge Moreland. Ms. Hendricks, I have reviewed the additional materials you submitted this evening. The hearing next week will now include testimony about systematic corruption of framework implementation at the state level. Federal investigators will be present. This has become larger than any of us anticipated. I trust you are prepared for that. Moreland. Victoria was not prepared. Not for lawsuits or threats or federal investigations. Not for her daughter testifying about trauma or her career ending in public disgrace. Not for any of it. But she was committed. And sometimes commitment had to be enough. She closed her laptop and looked at the photographs on her walls. Emily at every age, growing up in frames while the real Emily had grown distant. Not anymore. Not after this. Victoria Hendricks went to bed that night knowing she had finally chosen correctly. Her daughter over her job, truth over security, integrity over reputation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that made all the difference. The weekend before the hearing arrived with unseasonable rain. Victoria woke Saturday morning to the sound of water against her apartment windows, steady and relentless, the kind of Pacific Northwest downpour that turned the city gray and made the inside of buildings feel like shelters against the world. She lay in bed listening to Emily breathe in the next room, her daughter home for the first time in years, and felt the weight of what they were about to do settle over her like a physical thing. 5 days until the hearing. 5 days to prepare testimony that would expose years of systematic corruption. 5 days until her career officially ended, and whatever came after began. She made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness and sat at her kitchen table with Daniel Chen's files spread before her. The court clerk had been working through the night, tracing connections that went back further than any of them had realized. The Zero Tolerance Initiative funding did not start with Victoria's hiring 4 years ago. It went back 7 years, to the initial implementation of Marcus Webb's framework, to a time when the protections for children were being written into law and simultaneously being undermined by the very people tasked with implementing them. Dr. James Kirkland's name appeared again and again in the documents: committee appointments, training material authorship, consulting contracts with private prison corporations, a pattern so clear in retrospect that Victoria wondered how she had missed it, how they had all missed it. But that was the nature of corruption that worked through procedure. It hid in plain sight, dressed in the language of efficiency and best practices, camouflaged as legitimate policy work. Her phone buzzed with the text from Daniel. Found 3 more compliance officers willing to talk. They have similar stories. Training that contradicted the framework. Pressure to meet prosecution metrics. All hired the same year you were. Victoria replied, "Can you get them together? We need to coordinate testimony. Community Center, 2 p.m. I already reserved the room." Emily emerged from her bedroom at 7, her hair tangled from sleep, wearing an old volleyball team shirt that Victoria remembered buying at a fundraiser years ago. She poured herself coffee and sat across from her mother at the table covered in documents. "Did you sleep at all?" Emily asked. "A little. You?" "I kept having dreams about the hearing, about standing up there and everyone staring at me." Victoria reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. The gesture felt both familiar and strange, an echo of comfort from years past trying to find its way back into the present. "You do not have to testify if you are not ready." "I am not ready, but I am going to do it anyway." Emily squeezed her mother's hand. Being ready is not the point. Being brave is. They spent the morning refining Emily's testimony. The process was painful, each revision forcing Emily to relive trauma in sharper detail. But she worked through it with a determination that made Victoria's chest ache with pride and regret in equal measure. This strength had always been in her daughter, but Victoria had failed to protect it when it mattered most. At noon, Marcus Webb called. "Victoria, I have been thinking about the hearing, about what we need to accomplish." "I am listening." We have evidence of systematic violations. We have your testimony and Emily's testimony. But to stop Kirkland from nationalizing this corrupted system, we need to show it is not just about Seattle. We need other districts, other victims, a pattern that crosses state lines. I do not have contacts in other districts. I do. I implemented the framework in 6 pilot districts. I can reach out to compliance officers, advocates, families who might have seen similar violations. Victoria closed her eyes. Marcus had been the architect of a system meant to protect children, and now he was being forced to investigate how thoroughly it had been corrupted. The irony was brutal. That is a lot of work for 5 days. I have help. Sarah Chen, the investigative reporter. She has sources in other states. And Judge Moreland has authorized federal investigators to interview witnesses. The hearing is not just about our district anymore. It is about the entire pilot program. After they hung up, Victoria sat with the phone in her hand and tried to process the expanding scope of what they faced. This was no longer about one compliance officer who had violated protocol. It was about a coordinated effort to weaponize a child protection framework for profit and political gain. And she had been a small part of that machinery, a cog that had turned without questioning what it was grinding up. Emily looked up from her laptop where she had been reading news coverage of the upcoming hearing. "Mom, they are calling you a whistleblower." "I am not a whistleblower. I am someone who participated in the corruption and finally found the courage to admit it." "The articles say you are risking everything. Your career, your savings, your reputation." "I already lost what mattered most 3 years ago. I am just trying to get some of it back." At 2 o'clock, Victoria and Emily arrived at the Northgate Community Center, a low brick building that smelled of old coffee and institutional cleaning supplies. Daniel Chen had reserved a meeting room that overlooked a small park where children played despite the rain. The irony of preparing testimony about failed child protection while watching children play freely was not lost on Victoria. The room filled slowly. Daniel arrived first, carrying boxes of files that he had copied at personal expense because official channels had been closed to him after he started helping Victoria. Then came Grace Martinez, Victoria's former assistant, who had brought 3 other current compliance officers from different districts around Seattle. Patricia Vance arrived next, the child advocate who had represented Sophie Webb. She brought with her 2 other advocates who had seen similar violations in their cases. And then the families began to arrive. Maria Rodriguez came with her daughter Mia, the girl Sophie Webb had defended from Tyler Ashford. They were followed by 3 other mothers, whose daughters had been processed through the compliance office over the past 4 years. Each carried the same careful guardedness that Victoria recognized from her own relationship with Emily, the protective distance that develops when trust has been broken by people who should have been safe. The last to arrive were 2 women Victoria did not know. They introduced themselves as compliance officers from Tacoma and Spokane, districts that had also implemented the Zero Tolerance Initiative. They had read about Victoria's complaint in the news and had driven 3 hours through the rain to share their stories. 15 women and 1 man, gathered in a room that smelled like stale coffee, united by the common experience of watching a system fail the children it was designed to protect. Victoria stood at the front of the room, acutely aware that many of these people had been harmed by the very procedures she had enforced. She did not have a right to lead this meeting. She barely had a right to be in the room. "Thank you for coming. I am Victoria Hendricks. Most of you know that I was Chief Compliance Officer until I was suspended for filing a complaint about framework violations. What you might not know is that I personally participated in those violations for 4 years." The room was silent. Rain drummed against the windows. Somewhere in the building, children's voices echoed from a birthday party in another room, a reminder that life continued in its ordinary patterns, even as they prepared to disrupt those patterns completely. "I cannot undo what I did. I cannot give back the dignity I took or repair the trust I broke. But I can stand here today and tell you that I am prepared to testify publicly about everything. The training that taught me to prioritize metrics over children, the political pressure from powerful families, the financial incentives that rewarded aggressive prosecution, all of it." Maria Rodriguez raised her hand. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her voice carried weight when she spoke. "Why should we trust you? You were part of the system that hurt our children. You should not trust me. I have to earn that. but I am asking you to trust that the truth matters, that exposing this corruption publicly is the only way to prevent it from continuing. One of the compliance officers from Tacoma spoke up. Ms. Hendricks, I received the same training you did, the same pressure to meet metrics, the same performance bonuses tied to prosecution rates. I enforce the same violations. If you are guilty, so am I. Then we are all guilty, said the woman from Spokane, and we all have a choice about what to do with that guilt. The mothers in the room leaned forward. They knew this story. They had lived versions of it. For 3 years, I did not speak to my mother about what happened. I signed an NDA and took settlement money and tried to pretend that silence would heal me. It did not. It just made me feel alone. Emily looked at Victoria. When my mother called and told me she was breaking the NDA, that she was willing to lose everything to tell the truth, I did not believe her at first, but she did it. She filed the complaint, she is here, and now I am here too. Emily addressed the other daughters in the room, the girls who had been processed through a system that treated them as evidence instead of as people. I know what it is like to be afraid, to think that speaking up will only make things worse, but I also know what it is like to stay silent, and silence is its own kind of worse. Her mother put an arm around her shoulders, protective and proud in the same gesture. Sophie Webb stopped him. She pushed him away from me, and then the system tried to punish her for it. They wanted to take her clothes, to humiliate her, to make her the one who did something wrong. Mia's voice grew stronger. If we do not testify, if we stay quiet, then Tyler and people like him keep getting away with it. And girls like us keep getting punished for defending ourselves. Patricia Vance, the advocate, took careful notes. This is a pattern, systematic, deliberate, across multiple districts and multiple years. When we present this at the hearing, when Judge Moreland sees that it is not isolated incidents but coordinated corruption, she will have to act. Daniel spread out a timeline he had constructed. The Zero Tolerance Initiative was established 7 years ago, the same year the framework was implemented. Dr. Kirkland was on the committee that approved the framework. He also wrote the training materials for compliance officers, and his consulting firm has been receiving payments from private prison contractors since before the framework was finalized. He pointed to a series of highlighted connections. Kirkland testified before the state legislature about the need for accountability in juvenile justice. He recommended pilot programs. He suggested performance metrics. And then his firm created the Zero Tolerance Initiative that funded those programs based on prosecution rates. He built the corruption into the system from the beginning, Victoria said. And he is about to take it national. Next month, he testifies before Congress about expanding the Seattle pilot program to other states. If we do not stop him at this hearing, dozens of districts will implement the same corrupted version of the framework. The weight of that reality settled over the room. They were not just fighting for accountability in Seattle. They were fighting to prevent the systematic abuse of children from becoming national policy. Grace Martinez, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I have something to add. I have been documenting compliance violations for 2 years. I was too afraid to report them officially, but I kept records. Emails from supervisors telling us to prioritize cases involving influential families. Memos about performance bonuses tied to prosecution targets. Training materials that explicitly contradicted the framework. She pulled out a folder thick with documents. And I have recordings. I recorded my performance review last year when my supervisor told me I needed to be more aggressive in evidence collection or I would not get my bonus. I recorded the training session where we were told the framework safeguards were flexible guidelines, not legal requirements. Victoria stared at her former assistant. Grace, that could cost you your job. I already quit. This morning, sent my resignation by email. I would rather be unemployed than complicit. The room erupted in conversation. Questions about testimony logistics, concerns about legal retaliation, fear about public exposure. But underneath the anxiety, Victoria sensed something else. Relief. The relief that comes from finally being able to tell the truth after years of enforced silence. They worked through the afternoon, coordinating testimony and organizing evidence. Patricia Vance explained the hearing format, what questions to expect, how to handle cross-examination from attorneys who would try to discredit them. Daniel walked through the documentation timeline. Victoria and the other compliance officers compared notes about their training. finding disturbing similarities in how they had all been taught to circumvent the framework. By 5 o'clock, they had a strategy: 15 witnesses ready to testify, hundreds of pages of documentation, recordings and emails and case files that told the story of systematic corruption more clearly than any single testimony could. Victoria met her eyes. You had every right to. But you stopped. You did not go through with it. And then you did something harder than just stopping. You admitted you were wrong publicly, at great cost. Maria paused. My daughter sees that. She sees that even people who do wrong things can choose to do right things. That matters. After everyone left, Victoria and Emily sat alone in the empty meeting room. The rain had stopped. Evening light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the air like tiny galaxies. Mom, are you okay? Victoria thought about the question. Was she okay? No. She was terrified and exhausted and facing financial ruin and public humiliation. But she was also lighter than she had been in years, unburdened by the weight of secrets and complicity. I am better than I have been in a long time. They drove home through streets slick with rain, the city washed clean and gleaming. Victoria's phone rang as they pulled into the parking garage. Marcus Webb. How did the meeting go? Better than I hoped. We have 15 witnesses, solid documentation, recordings. Good, because I have news you need to hear. Federal investigators interviewed Dr. Kirkland this afternoon, confronted him with the funding connections, the training materials, the timeline of corruption. What did he say? He denied everything. Said the Zero Tolerance Initiative was legitimate policy reform. Said any violations were the result of individual compliance officers misinterpreting guidance. Said you and the others testifying are disgruntled employees trying to shift blame. Victoria felt anger flare hot in her chest. He is setting us up to be scapegoats. Exactly, which is why what I'm about to tell you is important. The investigators do not believe him. They think he is lying. But they need proof, not just circumstantial connections. They need someone who was in the room when decisions were made, who can testify about intentional corruption. Who? His former assistant, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Torres. She worked for Kirkland from the beginning, helped him draft the implementation plan for the framework. She quit 6 months ago and has been trying to decide whether to come forward. Did she? She will, but she wants to meet with you first. She wants to know if going public will actually change anything or if it will just destroy her career for nothing. Victoria understood that fear intimately. The calculation of whether speaking truth was worth the cost when the system seemed designed to protect itself. When does she want to meet? Tomorrow, neutral location. She is flying in from Washington, D.C. tonight. Tell her yes. Tell her I will meet her anywhere. They arranged the meeting for Sunday morning at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, far enough from the courthouse to avoid familiar faces. Victoria hung up and sat in her car, engine off, staring at the concrete wall of the parking garage. Emily touched her arm. Mom, what is wrong? Nothing is wrong. Something might actually be right. She turned to her daughter. Kirkland's former assistant is willing to testify. If she can prove he deliberately corrupted the framework implementation, it stops being our word against his. It becomes evidence of criminal conspiracy. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear, the rain blown through and leaving behind blue sky that felt like a promise. Victoria and Emily met Marcus at the coffee shop, a small place with mismatched furniture and art from local painters on the walls. Dr. Rebecca Torres was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a laptop and an expression that Victoria recognized. The look of someone who had made a decision but was still terrified by it. She was younger than Victoria expected, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail and glasses that she pushed up her nose in a nervous gesture. When Victoria approached, Rebecca stood and offered her hand. Ms. Hendricks, thank you for meeting me. They sat. Marcus made introductions. Emily ordered coffee for everyone, a small domestic gesture that helped ease the tension. Rebecca opened her laptop and turned it so they could see the screen. I worked for Dr. Kirkland for 6 years. I helped him design the Zero Tolerance Initiative. I drafted training materials. I sat in meetings where we discussed how to implement the framework in ways that would increase prosecution rates without triggering legal challenges. She clicked through files, emails, meeting minutes, budget documents. I did not understand what we were doing at first. Kirkland framed it as making the system more efficient, holding juveniles accountable, preventing crime through early intervention. It all sounded reasonable, noble, even. When did you realize it was not? Victoria asked. About 3 years ago. I was reviewing outcomes data for the pilot districts. The prosecution rates had gone up, which Kirkland saw as success. But I started reading the actual case files. I saw children being processed for minor offenses. I saw families pressured into plea deals. I saw a pattern of targeting poor families, minority families, families who could not afford lawyers to fight back. Rebecca's voice shook. I saw children having their dignity stripped away in the name of evidence collection. And I realized we were not holding juveniles accountable. We were feeding them into a system that profited from their incarceration. Why did you not come forward then? Because Kirkland had me sign NDAs. Because I was afraid of being sued, of losing my career, of being labeled a troublemaker who would never work in policy again. She looked directly at Victoria. The same reasons you did not come forward 4 years ago when you violated your daughter's rights. The parallel was exact and painful. 2 women who had participated in corruption and stayed silent out of fear. The difference was that Rebecca had not been forced to confront her complicity by watching her own daughter suffer. What changed? Marcus asked. Some. I read about your complaint, Ms. Hendricks. I read about your daughter testifying. And I thought about all the children I helped process through a corrupted system. I thought about the fact that Kirkland is about to take this national, that dozens more districts will implement the same violations we piloted here. Rebecca closed her laptop. I cannot live with that. Not anymore. If you testify, he will destroy you, Victoria said. He has resources, political connections. He will call you a disgruntled employee. He will enforce the NDAs. He will make sure you never work in policy again. I know, but if I do not testify, he wins. The corruption continues. More children suffer, and I stay silent while knowing I could have stopped it. Emily spoke for the first time. What do you need from us? Rebecca looked at her, at this young woman who was about to testify about her own trauma to stop a system from harming others. I need to know it will matter, that we are not just destroying ourselves for nothing. I cannot promise it will matter, Victoria said. I can only promise we will try. Then I will testify. They spent 3 hours going through Rebecca's documentation. She had saved everything despite the NDAs. Emails from Kirkland discussing how to train compliance officers to prioritize prosecution. Meeting minutes where private prison contractors explained their preferred metrics. Budget documents showing how zero-tolerance initiative funding was tied to increased juvenile detention rates. The evidence was damning, not circumstantial, not interpretable, just clear documentation of deliberate corruption. Marcus reviewed it all with the careful attention of someone who had built the system being corrupted. His face grew harder with each page. He knew, Marcus said finally. From the beginning, he knew he was perverting the framework. This was not bureaucratic drift or misinterpretation. This was intentional sabotage. Why? Emily asked. Why would someone do this deliberately? Rebecca answered. Money and power. The private prison industry pays well for consultants who can increase their client base. And politically, being tough on crime plays well with certain voters. Kirkland built his reputation on the zero-tolerance initiative. It got him appointed state policy director. It got him invited to testify before Congress. If the national expansion happens, he becomes one of the most influential voices in juvenile justice policy. Built on the suffering of children, Victoria said. Built on the suffering of children who could not fight back. That was the genius of it. Target poor families, marginalized communities, people who would not have resources to challenge the system. Make it look like accountability and justice when it was really just exploitation. The coffee shop had filled around them as the morning progressed. Young couples on dates, students with textbooks, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that 4 people in the corner booth were preparing to expose a conspiracy that reached from Seattle to Washington, D.C. Marcus's phone rang. He stepped outside to take the call, and when he returned, his expression was grim. That was Judge Moreland. Councilman Ashford has filed a motion to close the hearing. He is claiming it will expose his son Tyler to public humiliation and violate his privacy rights as a minor. Can she do that? Close the hearing? Victoria's stomach dropped. She can, but she does not want to. She is fighting the motion, arguing that public interest outweighs privacy concerns. But Ashford has hired expensive attorneys. They are good. Rebecca looked at Victoria. If the hearing is closed, if the testimony is sealed, Kirkland can control the narrative. He can dismiss everything as internal personnel disputes. The exposure loses its power. We need the hearing to be public, Emily said. We need people to see what happened. Marcus nodded. Judge Moreland knows that, but she is being pressured. The court administration is worried about media circus. The state attorney general's office is concerned about the political implications. She is trying to thread a very narrow needle. They left the coffee shop in the early afternoon and stood on the sidewalk in pale winter sunlight. 4 people united by the decision to tell the truth, despite the cost. Victoria felt the burden of what they were attempting settle over her like a cloak. They were taking on a state official with political backing. They were exposing a system that had powerful people invested in keeping it hidden. They were asking a judge to rule against influential families and wealthy interests. The odds were not good. But standing there with her daughter beside her, with Marcus Webb, who had built protections that were meant to matter, with Rebecca Torres, who was willing to sacrifice everything to expose the truth, Victoria felt something she had not felt in 4 years. Hope. They would tell the truth. The system would have to listen. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Monday brought new pressures. Victoria's attorney called to inform her that the lawsuit over the NDA had expanded. 3 more families had joined as plaintiffs. The damages now totaled $800,000. Her attorney said it quietly, gently, the way you might tell someone they have a terminal illness. Can we fight it? Victoria asked. We can, but fighting will cost money you do not have. They are betting you will fold under financial pressure. Tell them I am not folding. Emily found Victoria sitting at the kitchen table that afternoon, staring at a stack of bills and bank statements. The math was brutal. Even with Marcus's help, even with pro bono legal support, the costs of fighting this battle were overwhelming. Mom, we will figure it out. There is nothing to figure out. I do not have $800,000. I do not have $80,000. Victoria laughed, a sound without humor. I spent 20 years building a career that I am now destroying. The irony is remarkable. You are not destroying your career. You are choosing something more important. That does not pay the bills. Emily sat across from her mother. Do you remember when I was 12 and I wanted to quit volleyball because I was afraid I was not good enough? I remember. You told me that being afraid was not a reason to quit. That the only valid reason to quit was if I did not care anymore. You said if I still cared, I had to keep trying even when it was hard. Victoria looked at her daughter. I am not sure this analogy applies to financial ruin. It applies to everything. Do you still care? Yes. Then we keep trying. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Victoria and Emily practiced testimony. They met with Patricia Vance to prepare for cross-examination. They coordinated with the other witnesses, making sure everyone understood the hearing format and what to expect. Daniel Chen brought more documentation. Grace Martinez brought more recordings. The compliance officers from Tacoma and Spokane brought evidence from their districts. The pile of proof grew until it filled boxes that Daniel stored in his apartment because Victoria's office was no longer accessible to her. Wednesday night, 2 days before the hearing, Judge Moreland's ruling on the closure motion came through. The hearing would remain public. Media access granted but controlled. Cameras allowed but with restrictions to protect minor witnesses. Ashford immediately filed an appeal, but the appeal would not be heard before Friday. The hearing would proceed as scheduled. Victoria read the ruling 3 times, looking for loopholes or conditions that might undermine them. But Judge Moreland had been clear. The public interest in transparency outweighed privacy concerns. The systematic nature of the allegations required public scrutiny. She called Marcus to tell him, "We have our chance," he said. "Now we need to make it count." Thursday arrived with the gray skies that threatened more rain. Victoria woke early and found Emily already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her testimony printed out, reading it over and over. "You do not have to memorize it," Victoria said. "They will let you read from it if you need to." "I do not want to need to. I want to look at them, at Kirkland and Ashford and everyone who thinks they can silence us. I want them to see my face when I tell them what they did." The doorbell rang at 8 in the morning. Victoria opened it to find Marcus standing there with 2 cups of coffee and a folder under his arm. "Thought you might need this." He handed her a coffee. "And I wanted to show you something before tomorrow." He spread out a document on the kitchen table. It was a letter. signed by juvenile justice advocates from 6 states. After Rebecca came forward, I reached out to my contacts in the other pilot districts. Every single one found evidence of similar violations: training that contradicted the framework, pressure to meet prosecution metrics, financial incentives tied to juvenile detention rates. They are all testifying? Not all. Some are too afraid, but enough. Enough to show this is not just Seattle. This is systematic across every district where the Zero Tolerance Initiative was implemented. Victoria read through the letter. Advocates and compliance officers and families from California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, all describing the same pattern, all ready to submit evidence to the hearing. This is national, she said. It always was. We were just seeing one piece of it. The weight of that realization pressed down on Victoria's shoulders. They were not just fighting for Seattle's children. They were fighting for every child who would be processed through this corrupted system if Kirkland's national expansion succeeded. Emily read the letter over her mother's shoulder. How many kids? Marcus looked at the numbers he had compiled. Across the 6 pilot districts over 7 years, at least 2,000 children processed through compliance procedures that violated the framework. 2,000 kids who should have been protected and were exploited instead. 2,000. The number was staggering. Each one a person, each one with a story, each one harmed by a system that was supposed to help them. We cannot save them retroactively, Victoria said, but we can stop it from happening to 2,000 more. They spent Thursday afternoon in final preparation. Patricia Vance conducted mock cross-examinations, playing the role of aggressive defense attorney, pushing witnesses to see how they would respond under pressure. Some broke down, some got angry, but all of them held to the truth. That evening, Victoria and Emily made dinner together. Simple pasta, salad, bread. The ritual of cooking side by side in the small kitchen felt sacred somehow. A reminder that whatever happened tomorrow, they had this: the relationship they were rebuilding, the trust they were earning back. After dinner, Emily brought out an old photo album, pictures from before, birthday parties and volleyball games, and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable when they were happening, but now felt precious. I want to remember, Emily said, before tomorrow changes everything. I want to remember that we were a family once, and we are becoming one again. They looked through the album together, Victoria's arm around her daughter's shoulders, both of them crying and laughing at memories that felt both distant and immediate. At midnight, Victoria received an email. No sender name. Subject line, last warning. Withdraw tomorrow or you will regret it. We have information about Emily's assault that will destroy her if it becomes public. Testimony about her drinking at the party. Witnesses who will say she initiated contact with her assailant. We will make her the villain in her own assault. This is your last chance to protect your daughter. Victoria's hands shook as she read it. They were threatening to smear Emily, to use victim-blaming tactics that would re-traumatize her publicly. It was evil, and it was effective, because Victoria's first instinct was to protect her daughter at any cost. She showed Emily the email. They are bluffing, Emily said. I was not drinking. I did not initiate anything. They are hoping we will be too scared to call their bluff. They might not be bluffing. They might have people willing to lie. Then we tell the truth louder than they can lie. Emily's voice was steady. Mom, I am not backing down. If they want to smear me, they can try. But I am testifying tomorrow. Victoria looked at her daughter and saw the strength that had always been there. The courage that Victoria had failed to protect 4 years ago but was honoring now. Then we both testify, and we let the truth speak for itself. She deleted the email without responding. They went to bed knowing that tomorrow would change everything. The hearing would expose corruption that reached from Seattle to Washington, D.C. It would implicate powerful people who would fight back viciously. It would cost them in ways they could not fully anticipate, but it would also be the truth, finally, completely, without equivocation or compromise. Victoria lay in bed and thought about Marcus Webb's framework, the protections he had carefully built to ensure children would be treated with dignity. She thought about how those protections had been systematically undermined by people who saw children as metrics and opportunities, rather than as human beings deserving of respect. And she thought about the 2,000 children who had been processed through a corrupted system, each one carrying trauma that might never fully heal. Tomorrow, they would stand in a public hearing and name that corruption. They would face the people who had profited from it and the people who had enabled it. They would tell the stories that had been silenced by NDAs and threats and fear. It would not undo the harm, but it might prevent future harm. And in the calculus of redemption, that had to count for something. Victoria fell asleep to the sound of Emily breathing in the next room, her daughter home and safe and brave beyond measure. Tomorrow they would both be braver still. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and cold. Victoria woke before her alarm, adrenaline surging through her system in a way that made sleep impossible. She made coffee with shaking hands and watched the sun rise over the city, painting the buildings in shades of gold and rose that seemed too beautiful for a day that would be so difficult. Emily emerged at 6, already dressed in the simple dark suit they had chosen together. Professional, but not severe. Respectful, but not apologetic. The armor of someone who had decided to stand in her truth regardless of the cost. "Ready?" Emily asked. Victoria thought about the question. Was she ready to end her career publicly, to face financial ruin, to sit across from people who would call her a liar and a troublemaker and a failed mother? No, she was not ready. But ready was not required, only willing, as ready as I will ever be. They drove to the courthouse together in silence. The building loomed against the morning sky, concrete and glass, and the weight of justice that was supposed to matter. The parking lot was already filling with media vans, their satellite dishes extended like antennae searching for signal. Marcus met them at the employee entrance. He looked tired, as though he had not slept either, but his presence was steady in the way that Victoria had come to rely on. Big crowd already gathering. Judge Moreland arrived early to review final motions. Kirkland is here with a team of attorneys. Ashford brought his own lawyers too. "We have the truth," Victoria said. "They have lawyers. Truth needs to be told well to matter. Are you ready to tell it?" Victoria looked at Emily, at this daughter who was braver than she had any right to ask her to be. Then at Marcus, who had built protections that should have worked but had been corrupted by people he had trusted. "We are ready." They walked into the courthouse together. 3 people about to change everything. 3 people choosing truth over safety. The hearing would begin in 2 hours, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom filled slowly, like water rising in a basin. Victoria sat at the witness table beside Patricia Vance, watching strangers file into the gallery, their faces carrying that peculiar blend of curiosity and judgment that comes with public spectacle. Reporters occupied the first 2 rows, notebooks ready, cameras positioned at angles the judge had approved. Behind them sat advocates and families, some Victoria recognized from the community center meeting, others she had never seen, but who carried the same careful guardedness of people who had been failed by systems they should have been able to trust. Emily sat in the second row with Marcus Webb beside her. Her daughter's face was pale but composed, hands folded in her lap in a way that reminded Victoria of Emily as a child, waiting for her turn at volleyball tryouts or piano recitals. That same determination mixed with fear, that same refusal to back down despite the terror. The defense tables were crowded. Councilman Bradley Ashford sat with 3 attorneys in expensive suits, their briefcases arranged like fortifications. Dr. James Kirkland occupied another table with his own legal team, 2 men and a woman who looked like they charged by the minute and won by intimidation. Grace Martinez had counted 7 attorneys total arrayed against them, corporate law firms with resources that dwarfed the pro bono support Victoria had cobbled together. Daniel Chen sat at the clerk's desk, his usual careful expression replaced by something harder. He had been working 18-hour days for a week, organizing documents and coordinating witnesses, knowing that his career in court administration was likely over regardless of the outcome. Some choices burned bridges behind you. This was one of them. Judge Patricia Moreland entered at exactly 9 o'clock. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone stood. The judge wore her customary black robe and an expression Victoria had learned to recognize over 4 years of appearing before her. The look of someone preparing to make decisions that would satisfy no one, but hopefully serve justice. "Be seated." Judge Moreland arranged her papers with precise movements. "We are convened in the matter of compliance framework violations, juvenile dignity protections, and related allegations of systematic corruption. This is a public hearing. though I remind media present that certain testimony involves minors and will be handled with appropriate sensitivity. She looked directly at Victoria. Ms. Hendricks, you filed the initial complaint. You will testify first. Victoria stood on legs that felt unreliable. Patricia Vance rose beside her, a steadying presence, but Victoria would face the questions alone. She took the oath with her hand on a Bible that felt heavier than it should, swearing to tell the truth as though truth were simple and straightforward rather than complicated and damning. Ms. Hendricks, please state your position for the record. I was Chief Compliance Officer for the Monroe Federal Courthouse Juvenile Division until I was suspended 2 weeks ago for filing this complaint. And what prompted you to file the complaint? Victoria had practiced this answer, refined it with Patricia Vance's help, stripped it of excess and emotion until only facts remained. But sitting in the witness chair with Emily's eyes on her, and the weight of 20 years of work about to be dismantled by her own testimony, the practiced words felt insufficient. I attempted to violate the rights of a 16-year-old girl named Sophie Webb. Her father stopped me by asking questions I could not answer with legal authority. In that moment, I realized I had been violating children's rights systematically for 4 years and calling it procedure. The courtroom was silent. Someone's pen scratched against paper. The ventilation system hummed. Can you be more specific about these violations? Victoria took a breath. This was the moment she had prepared for, but preparation did not make confession easier. The Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework, authored by Marcus Webb, and implemented in this district 7 years ago, requires 3 specific things before any invasive evidence collection from minors: written parental consent, independent advocacy, court authorization. These are not suggestions, they are legal requirements. She paused, letting the weight of what came next settle over her shoulders. I was trained to ignore all 3 requirements. On my second day of work, my supervisor told me the framework safeguards were idealistic but impractical. That in the real world, we had to balance child protection against case efficiency and resource constraints. That good judgment mattered more than rigid adherence to procedure. Victoria pulled out her training manual, the pages now marked with sticky notes flagging contradictions. This manual, the one every compliance officer receives, contradicts the framework on 17 separate points. It uses language like flexible interpretation and contextual application to create permission for violations. And it does so deliberately because the people who wrote this manual understood that direct orders to violate the framework would create liability. But training materials that encourage creative interpretation would give them plausible deniability. Kirkland's attorney objected. Your Honor, the witness is characterizing training materials without foundation. She is speculating about intent. Judge Moreland looked at the attorney with an expression that could have frozen water. Overruled. Ms. Hendricks spent 4 years implementing these training materials. She has foundation. And her testimony about what she was taught is not speculation. It is firsthand account. Continue, Ms. Hendricks. Victoria pulled out the first document from the folder Patricia had prepared. This is the training manual I received when I was hired 4 years ago. Page 17 states that framework safeguards are flexible guidelines to be balanced against case urgency and resource constraints. That language appears nowhere in the actual framework. It was added by trainers to create permission for violations. She walked through the evidence methodically. The performance reviews that praised her for aggressive evidence collection. The bonus structure tied to juvenile prosecution rates. The emails from supervisors pressuring her to resolve cases involving influential families quickly and quietly. I followed these procedures for 4 years. I processed dozens of children through a system that was supposed to protect them, but instead treated them as evidence and opportunities. I did this because I was trained to do it, because I was rewarded for doing it, and because I was too cowardly to question whether it was legal. Patricia Vance spoke for the first time. Ms. Hendricks, did you violate the framework in your own daughter's case? The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria looked at Emily, at her daughter's face carefully blank in the way she had learned to protect herself. Yes, 4 years ago, my daughter was sexually assaulted. 3 days later, I demanded she remove her clothing for evidence collection. No written consent, no independent advocate, no court authorization. I violated every protection the framework provided because I was following the training I had received. What was the result? I traumatized my daughter almost as much as the assault itself had. I prioritized procedure over her dignity, and I destroyed our relationship for 3 years because she could not trust that I would protect her over my career. Victoria's voice cracked on the last words. She forced herself to continue. My daughter signed an NDA and took settlement money, and we both stayed silent about what the compliance office had done. Until 2 weeks ago, when I watched myself about to make the same mistake with Sophie Webb, and finally found the courage to choose differently. Ashford's lead attorney stood for cross-examination. He was tall and silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who had spent decades perfecting the art of making witnesses doubt their own memories. Ms. Hendricks, you are aware that your daughter's case involves serious allegations against the son of a prominent family? Yes. And that the compliance office had legitimate concerns about evidence preservation? The concerns were legitimate, the methods were not. Is it not possible that you are reframing proper procedure as violations in order to excuse your own failures as a parent? Patricia objected, but the judge allowed it. Victoria met the attorney's eyes steadily. I failed as a parent because I chose procedure over protection. That failure is what prompted this complaint. I am not excusing it. I am exposing the system that taught me to make that choice. The attorney tried several more approaches, suggesting Victoria was motivated by revenge, by attention-seeking, by desire to shift blame for her daughter's suffering. Each question revealed his strategy. Make her the problem. Make her credibility the issue. Distract from the systematic violations by focusing on individual motivation. But Victoria had spent 4 years enforcing procedures she had not questioned. She knew how systems deflected accountability, and she refused to let it work this time. After an hour of cross-examination, the judge called a brief recess. Victoria returned to the witness table, shaking from adrenaline but intact. Emily caught her eye from the gallery and nodded once. Approval, pride, forgiveness that Victoria was still learning to accept. Patricia Vance leaned close. You did well. You told the truth without becoming defensive. That matters. When the hearing resumed, Patricia called Emily Hendricks to testify. Victoria watched her daughter stand and walk to the witness chair, with a composure that broke her heart. Emily was 22 years old and about to describe the worst experience of her life in a room full of strangers because the system that should have protected her had failed, and someone needed to say so publicly. Emily took the oath, stated her name, looked directly at the judge when she spoke. Her voice was steady in the way that comes from having practiced saying difficult truths, until they no longer catch in your throat. 4 years ago, I was sexually assaulted at a party. I was 18 years old. I had been accepted to college. I had plans and dreams and a future I was excited about. And then a boy whose father is a state senator decided my no meant nothing. She said it without flinching, without looking away, stating the fact as though it were weather or geography rather than trauma. The assault was terrible. I will not describe it in detail because that is not what this hearing is about. But I will say that it took something from me that I have spent 4 years trying to rebuild. My sense of safety, my trust in my own judgment, my belief that the world was fundamentally fair. Emily's hands were folded in her lap, knuckles white from the pressure she was exerting to keep them still. 3 days after the assault, after I had given a statement to police, after I had endured a rape kit examination at the hospital, after I had begun the impossible work of trying to process what had happened to me, my mother brought me to her office. She looked at Victoria for the first time, and the expression on her face was complex in ways that Victoria knew she deserved. My mother told me the compliance office needed my clothing for evidence. I asked if I could go home first. I asked if I could shower. I asked if I could have someone with me who was not a stranger. She said no to all of it. She said evidence had to be collected immediately or the integrity of the case would be compromised. Can you describe what happened next? Emily's voice remained steady, but something in her eyes changed, going distant in the way trauma survivors learn to dissociate when reliving becomes necessary. I was taken to a room. There were 4 people there. My mother, a woman I did not know who was taking photographs, a man who was cataloging items, another woman who was supposedly a victim advocate but who I had met 30 seconds before and who said nothing except to tell me the process would be brief. Emily's voice caught for the first time. I complied because she was my mother, and I thought if she was telling me this was necessary, it must be. I thought she would protect me, that she would not ask me to do something that would hurt me. How did it feel? It felt like the assault continuing, but with official sanction. The boy who assaulted me had taken my choice, my control over my own body. And then the compliance office, my own mother, did exactly the same thing. They told me what was required and expected me to comply without question or delay. Patricia Vance let that sit for a moment, let the courtroom absorb what Emily had described. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Did anyone explain your rights? Did anyone tell you that you could refuse, that you could request written consent forms, that you could have an independent advocate present who actually advocated for you? No, I was told what was required. I was told it was procedure. I was not told I had any choice in the matter. What happened after the evidence collection? Emily shifted in her chair, the composure cracking slightly at the edges. The case against my assailant was handled quietly. His father hired expensive attorneys. The compliance office negotiated a settlement. I was asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for money. My mother told me it was the best outcome, that going to trial would be traumatic, that the settlement protected me. Did you feel protected? I felt silenced. I felt like the system had processed me through a procedure and then paid me to pretend it had not violated me almost as much as the assault itself had. Emily's voice grew harder. For 3 years, I barely spoke to my mother. I went to college across the country. I changed my major from criminal justice because I could not imagine working in a system that had treated me the way this one did. I went to therapy twice a week, trying to understand why my own mother had chosen procedure over protecting me. She looked at Victoria again, and this time there was something different in her expression. Not just pain and anger, but the beginning of understanding. I know my mother believed she was following protocol. I know she thought she was doing her job correctly, but I needed her to be my mother, not a compliance officer. And when she had to choose, she chose wrong. Patricia asked the question everyone was thinking. So why are you here? Why testify in support of the mother who failed you? Emily straightened in her chair, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the courtroom with clarity that needed no amplification. Because 2 weeks ago, my mother called me. She told me that she had been about to do to another girl exactly what she did to me, that the girl's father had stopped her by asking questions my mother could not answer, that my mother had finally understood that what she did to me was not procedure, it was violation. And you believed her? I did not believe her at first. My mother had been telling me for 3 years that she followed protocol, that she did what was required, that my suffering was unfortunate but unavoidable. Why would I believe she had suddenly changed? Emily's hands unclenched slightly. But then she actually did change. She filed a complaint against her own office. She admitted publicly that she had violated the framework. She lost her job. She broke the NDA even though it meant we would be sued. She chose me over everything else she had built. Emily's voice grew stronger. I am testifying because if my story can prevent the compliance office from doing to other girls what they did to me, then it is worth telling. I am testifying because silence protected no one. It just made me feel alone. And I am testifying because my mother finally showed me that people who make terrible mistakes can still choose to do the right thing. The cross-examination was brutal. Ashford's attorney suggested Emily was lying about the lack of consent, suggested she was motivated by financial gain from her mother's lawsuit, suggested the trauma she described was self-inflicted drama rather than legitimate violation. But Emily did not waver. She answered each question with the same steady composure, returning again and again to the simple truth. The compliance office had violated the framework. Her mother had participated in that violation, and the system needed to be held accountable. When Emily finished testifying, Victoria wanted to rush to her, to hold her, to apologize again for every moment of the past 4 years. But Emily walked past her without stopping, returned to her seat beside Marcus, and sat with her back straight and her hands steady in her lap. That composure, that strength, was not something Victoria had given her. It was something Emily had built herself, in therapy and silence, and the long work of healing from violations that should never have happened. Patricia called the next witnesses in rapid succession. Maria Rodriguez described watching the compliance office attempt to take Sophie's clothing. Grace Martinez testified about documenting violations for 2 years while being too afraid to report them. The compliance officers from Tacoma and Spokane described receiving identical training that contradicted the framework. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence, not isolated incidents, not individual failures, a systematic pattern across multiple districts, coordinated by training that deliberately undermined legal protections. By lunch recess, the shape of the conspiracy was clear, but they still needed to prove it was deliberate. They needed someone who had been in the room when the decisions were made. They needed Rebecca Torres. The afternoon session began with Patricia calling Dr. Rebecca Torres to the stand. She entered the courtroom with the careful precision of someone who had decided this was necessary, but remained terrified by it. Former assistant to Dr. James Kirkland, helped design the Zero Tolerance Initiative. About to betray her former boss publicly, Rebecca took the oath and stated her credentials: 6 years as policy advisor, master's degree in public administration, doctorate in criminal justice, the kind of resume that opened doors and built careers. She was about to use it to close those doors permanently. Dr. Torres, can you describe your role in developing the Zero Tolerance Initiative? I was Dr. Kirkland's assistant. I helped draft the implementation plan for the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework across 6 pilot districts. I wrote training materials. I designed the metrics we would use to measure success. And what were those metrics? Juvenile prosecution rates, evidence collection efficiency, case resolution timelines, recidivism reduction. Rebecca's voice was clinical, the tone of someone reporting data. The stated goal was to hold juveniles accountable and prevent crime through early intervention. Was that the actual goal? Rebecca paused. The courtroom leaned forward imperceptibly, everyone sensing that this moment mattered. No, the actual goal was to increase juvenile detention rates in ways that appeared to be evidence-based policy reform. Kirkland's attorney jumped to his feet. Objection. The witness is speculating about intent. I am testifying about conversations I personally participated in. Rebecca's voice cut through the objection. I was in the meetings, I wrote the memos, I know what the goal was because Dr. Kirkland told me explicitly. Judge Moreland leaned forward. Overruled. Dr. Torres, please continue. Rebecca opened her laptop. I have emails, meeting minutes, and budget documents spanning 6 years. All of them show a coordinated effort to use the framework structure while undermining its safeguards. She walked through the evidence systematically. Emails from Kirkland discussing how to train compliance officers to prioritize prosecution without triggering legal challenges. Meeting minutes where private prison contractors explained their preferred metrics and funding models. Budget documents showing Zero Tolerance Initiative grants were directly tied to increased juvenile detention rates. Dr. Kirkland understood that the framework as written would protect children and reduce prosecution rates. That was not what his clients wanted. So he created training materials and incentive structures that would produce the opposite result while maintaining the appearance of following the framework. Who were his clients? Private prison corporations who profit from juvenile detention, political action committees that use tough-on-crime messaging, law enforcement unions that wanted metrics to justify budgets. He built a coalition of interests that all benefited from increased juvenile prosecution, and he used the framework as cover for what was essentially a pipeline from schools to detention. The courtroom erupted, reporters typing frantically, gallery members murmuring. Judge Moreland gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Not speculation, not interpretation. Direct testimony from someone who had been inside the conspiracy from the beginning. Rebecca continued through the afternoon, detailing meeting after meeting where Kirkland had discussed how to corrupt the framework implementation without leaving evidence of deliberate sabotage, how to phrase training materials so they appeared to align with the framework while actually contradicting it, how to pressure compliance officers through performance metrics rather than direct orders. He called it maintaining plausible deniability. If violations occurred, he could blame individual compliance officers for misinterpreting guidance, but the guidance was designed to be misinterpreted. That was the point. Kirkland's cross-examination was vicious. His attorney attacked Rebecca's credibility, her motives, her competence, suggested she was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for being passed over for promotion, suggested she had fabricated evidence to get attention, suggested her testimony was coordinated with Victoria to create a false narrative. But Rebecca had the documents, emails with Kirkland's signature, meeting minutes she had typed herself, Budget spreadsheets showing money flowing from private prison contractors to Kirkland's consulting firm to Zero Tolerance Initiative grants. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was real. When Rebecca finally stepped down, she looked exhausted and lighter at the same time. The burden of silence lifted even as the consequences of speaking began. Judge Moreland called another recess. Victoria stood on shaking legs and made her way to the hallway where Emily waited with Marcus and Patricia Vance. "Is it enough?" Emily asked. "Is it enough to stop him?" Patricia nodded slowly. "Rebecca's testimony changes everything. We are not just alleging violations anymore. We are proving conspiracy." Marcus looked toward the courtroom where Kirkland sat with his attorneys. "He will have a response. Men like that always do. They do not accept defeat quietly." The evening session began with Kirkland's defense. His lead attorney called character witnesses who testified about Kirkland's distinguished career, his commitment to juvenile justice reform, his reputation for integrity. State officials who praised the Zero Tolerance Initiative's outcomes. Law enforcement leaders who cited reduced recidivism statistics. But the statistics felt hollow after Rebecca's testimony. Reduced recidivism sounded positive until you understood it meant children were being detained longer, removed from communities, processed through a system that treated them as problems to be managed, rather than people to be protected. Then Kirkland himself took the stand. He was composed, even charming, answered questions with the smooth confidence of someone who had testified before legislative committees and won funding with presentations. He denied everything Rebecca had testified about. Dr. Torres is a talented policy analyst, but she fundamentally misunderstood the goals of the Zero Tolerance Initiative. We were creating accountability, not increasing incarceration. Any compliance officer who violated the framework did so against guidance, not because of it. How do you explain the emails Dr. Torres presented? Taken out of context. Policy discussions about implementation challenges are being reframed as evidence of conspiracy. It is intellectually dishonest. He attacked Victoria directly. Ms. Hendricks violated her daughter's rights because she was eager to prove herself in a new position. That failure is tragic, but it is not systematic. It is individual. And now she is trying to shift blame by claiming she was trained to do what she chose to do. Kirkland's testimony was effective because it was half true. Victoria had been eager to prove herself. She had made individual choices. But those choices had been shaped by training and incentives that Kirkland had designed. Patricia Vance's cross-examination focused on the documents, email after email where Kirkland discussed creating metrics that would drive prosecution rates, meeting minutes where he told private prison contractors their investment in zero-tolerance funding would produce measurable returns. Dr. Kirkland, what did you mean when you wrote that the framework safeguards were vague enough to interpret creatively? I meant that implementation would require judgment. And when you told prison contractors their funding would produce returns, what returns were you referencing? Improved public safety outcomes, not increased detention rates that would fill private juvenile facilities. That is a mischaracterization. The exchange continued for an hour, Kirkland deflecting and reframing every question. He was good at this. He had spent a career learning how to sound reasonable while pursuing agendas that benefited him. But Victoria watched the judge's face and saw skepticism growing, saw Judge Moreland making notes, circling passages in Rebecca's testimony, comparing them to Kirkland's denials. The hearing adjourned at 6 o'clock with a plan to resume tomorrow. Victoria left the courthouse exhausted and oddly hopeful. They had exposed the conspiracy. They had presented evidence. They had told truths that powerful people wanted hidden. But the fight was not over. That evening, Victoria and Emily returned to the apartment to find an envelope that had been slipped under their door. No postage. Hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You are destroying innocent people's careers over your own failures. Stop this now or face consequences you cannot imagine. Emily read it and handed it back to her mother. They are getting desperate. Desperate people are dangerous. So are people who have nothing left to lose. Emily met her mother's eyes. We have already lost our privacy, your career, our savings. What else can they take? What else? Victoria thought about that question. What else was there? They had given up everything except the truth itself. And that was the one thing they would not surrender. The cumulative weight of the testimony was devastating. Not because any single story was uniquely terrible, but because they were all so similar. The same language, the same pressure tactics, the same prioritization of efficiency over dignity. Mia Rodriguez testified about Tyler Ashford's harassment, about reporting it and being told she was overreacting, about Sophie Webb defending her and then being punished for it. The system protected Tyler because his father has power, and it tried to punish Sophie because she does not. That is not justice. That is corruption. The other girls who Tyler had harassed testified next. Their stories formed a pattern of predatory behavior that the school had ignored because of who Tyler's father was. Complaints filed and dismissed, witnesses who saw but did not report, a system that protected the powerful and blamed the vulnerable. Councilman Ashford sat rigid in his chair, face carefully neutral, but Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders. His son's behavior was being exposed publicly, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Then Patricia Vance did something unexpected. She called Tyler Ashford himself to testify. The courtroom stirred. Ashford's attorneys objected vehemently, but the judge allowed it, noting that Tyler was central to the initial complaint and had a right to speak. Tyler took the stand looking younger than his 16 years. His expensive clothes hung on him in a way that suggested recent weight loss. He did not meet his father's eyes. In fact, he seemed to be actively avoiding looking at the defense table, where Councilman Ashford sat with mounting fury barely concealed beneath professional composure. Patricia Vance approached the witness stand with the care of someone handling something fragile. Tyler was a victim in the official narrative, but everyone in the courtroom knew from the previous testimony that the reality was far more complicated. Tyler, you were identified as the victim in Sophie Webb's assault case. Can you describe what happened in the cafeteria that day? Tyler's voice was quiet, barely audible even in the hushed courtroom. The judge asked him to speak up. He took a breath and tried again. Sophie did not assault me. That is not what happened at all. Can you tell us what did happen? I was bothering Mia Rodriguez. I had my hands on her. She was trying to get away from me. Sophie saw what was happening and she pushed me away from Mia. Tyler's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. I lost my balance. I fell backwards and hit my head on the table edge. It was an accident during a struggle that I started. The courtroom was absolutely silent. This was not what anyone had expected. Tyler Ashford, protected by his father's political influence, testifying against his own interests. Tyler, when you say you were bothering Mia, can you be more specific? He flinched. I was touching her, on her waist. She told me to stop. I did not stop. I thought it was funny. I thought I could do whatever I wanted because of who my father is. Patricia let that admission sit for a moment. Is this the first time you have done something like this? Councilman Ashford was on his feet, his attorney pulling at his arm, trying to get him to sit down. Your Honor, my client objects to this line of questioning. His son is a minor and is clearly confused. Judge Moreland fixed Ashford with a look that could have cut steel. Councilman, your son is testifying under oath. Sit down or leave my courtroom. Ashford sat, but the fury radiating from him was palpable. Patricia continued gently. Tyler, you heard the testimony from Mia and the other girls yesterday. The testimony about your behavior toward them. I heard it. Tyler's voice broke. I heard every word, and I heard myself in their stories. I am the person they are afraid of. I am the reason they do not feel safe at school. I did that. Why did you agree to let your father file charges against Sophie if you knew she was defending Mia? I did not agree. I told my father what really happened. I told him Sophie was protecting Mia from me. He said it did not matter. He said the optics were bad, that I was injured and there were witnesses, that we could use it to our advantage. Tyler looked at his father for the first time. He told me that power means never having to admit you are wrong, that we could make this Sophie's fault if we controlled the narrative. And you went along with it? At first, yes, because I was scared, because I did not want to face what I had done, because it was easier to let my father handle it and pretend I was the victim. He wiped his eyes. But then I listened to those girls testify. I heard what I did to them. Mia talking about how scared she was. Jessica describing how I made her feel unsafe in her own school. And I realized that my father was teaching me to become someone who uses power to hurt people and then uses more power to escape consequences. Patricia asked the question that mattered most. Why are you testifying truthfully now? Tyler looked out at the gallery, at Mia and the other girls sitting together. Because I listened to Emily Hendricks talk about how her mother finally chose to do the right thing, even though it cost her everything. And I thought about what kind of person I want to be. I thought about whether I want to spend my life being protected by my father's power while hurting people, or whether I want to take responsibility for what I have done and try to become better. He turned to face Judge Moreland directly. I know testifying against what my father wanted will have consequences. He will be angry. Our relationship will probably never recover. But Emily was right when she said that being brave matters more than being ready. I am not ready for this, but I am doing it anyway. Tyler's testimony changed the fundamental narrative. This was not about a troubled girl who assaulted an innocent boy. This was about a privileged young man who had harassed multiple girls and faced no consequences because his father had power. And it was about a system that had tried to punish the girl who stopped him instead of the boy who had been harassing others for years. Ashford stormed out of the courtroom. His attorneys scrambled to follow. The hearing continued without them. The final testimony of the day came from Marcus Webb himself. He took the stand with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. A man who had built protections meant to matter, and was now watching them be validated after years of corruption. Mr. Webb, you authored the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework. Can you explain its core purpose? Children in the justice system are vulnerable. They are scared. They are often from families without resources to protect them. The framework was designed to ensure that no matter what they were accused of, their basic dignity would be protected, that they would have advocates, that procedures would be transparent, that they would be treated as people, not as problems. Do the training materials presented in this hearing align with that purpose? No. The training materials systematically undermined every protection I built. They taught compliance officers to view safeguards as obstacles rather than requirements. They created incentives for violations rather than compliance. Marcus pulled out the original framework document, the one he had written 7 years ago. I wrote this because I believe the system could protect children if it was designed correctly. What Dr. Kirkland did was take that design and corrupt it for profit. He used the structure I built to create the appearance of child protection while actually facilitating abuse. What would you like to see happen as a result of this hearing? Marcus looked at Victoria, at Emily, at the mothers and daughters who had testified. I want the framework restored to its original purpose. I want compliance officers retrained properly. I want oversight that cannot be corrupted by financial incentives. And I want the children who were harmed by this system to receive the protection they should have had from the beginning. Even though that protection comes too late for many of them, especially because it comes too late, we cannot undo the harm, but we can prevent future harm. And in the moral calculus we are all forced to make, that has to matter. The hearing adjourned for the day. Judge Moreland announced she would issue findings within 48 hours. Victoria left the courthouse with Emily and Marcus, walking through a gauntlet of reporters shouting questions. She did not answer. The testimony had spoken for itself. That night, Victoria could not sleep. She lay in bed thinking about everything that had been said, everything that had been exposed, the systematic corruption, the children harmed, the conspiracy that reached from Seattle to Washington, D.C., and she thought about Tyler Ashford, 16 years old, finding the courage to tell the truth about his own behavior despite his father's pressure. That took a different kind of bravery than Victoria's confession. Tyler had to acknowledge his own failures in real time rather than 4 years later, had to choose integrity over protection while still young enough to change course. Maybe there was hope in that. Maybe systems could change if enough people chose truth over convenience. Emily knocked on her door at midnight. Mom, are you awake? Come in. Emily sat on the edge of the bed the way she used to as a child when nightmares woke her. I cannot stop thinking about what Tyler said, about realizing he was the person in their stories. It was brave of him to testify. Do you think people can really change? Or do we just become better at hiding who we are? Victoria thought about the question, about her own transformation from complicit compliance officer to whistleblower, about whether that was change or just finally choosing to be who she should have been all along. I think people can choose differently. Whether that is change or revelation, I am not sure. But the choice matters. Emily was quiet for a moment. I forgive you, Mom. I know I said it before, but I want you to really hear it. I forgive you for what you did, and I am proud of what you are doing now. Victoria pulled her daughter into an embrace, both of them crying, both of them healing in the slow way that trust is rebuilt through consistent action over time. The next morning brought Judge Moreland's preliminary findings. She issued them in writing rather than open court, a dense legal document that Victoria read 3 times to make sure she understood. The findings were devastating to Kirkland and everyone who had enabled him. This court finds systematic violations of the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework across multiple districts spanning 7 years. Evidence presented demonstrates deliberate corruption of framework implementation through coordinated training, financial incentives, and political pressure. The court finds Dr. James Kirkland personally responsible for designing and implementing a system that prioritized prosecution metrics over child protection. His testimony claiming ignorance of violations is contradicted by extensive documentary evidence. The court finds multiple compliance officers, including Victoria Hendricks, participated in framework violations. However, the evidence shows these violations resulted from training and incentives deliberately designed to produce such outcomes. The judge ordered immediate reforms, independent oversight committees, retraining of all compliance officers using materials reviewed by juvenile advocates, elimination of performance bonuses tied to prosecution rates, review of all cases from the past 7 years for potential framework violations, and she referred Dr. Kirkland to federal prosecutors for investigation of conspiracy and fraud. Victoria read the findings in her apartment with Emily reading over her shoulder. When they finished, they sat in silence, processing what it meant. They had won, not completely, not without cost, but they had exposed the corruption and forced accountability. Victoria's phone rang. Patricia Vance. Did you see the findings? Just finished reading them. This is bigger than our hearing. Federal prosecutors are opening a full investigation. Other districts are suspending zero-tolerance initiative funding. Kirkland's testimony before Congress has been canceled. You did this, Victoria. You and Emily and everyone who found the courage to testify. After they hung up, Victoria looked at her daughter. We did this. Emily smiled. We did. The victory was real, but so were the costs. Victoria's career was over. She faced hundreds of thousands in lawsuit damages. Her reputation in juvenile justice circles was destroyed. But Emily was home. Their relationship was healing. And children across multiple states would have protections that actually worked instead of procedures that looked good on paper while facilitating abuse. In the moral calculus Marcus had referenced, that had to be enough. Victoria Hendricks had chosen truth, had paid the price for that choice, and had discovered that some things mattered more than career or reputation or financial security. Integrity mattered. Dignity mattered. Standing up for children who could not stand up for themselves mattered, and that made all the difference. The morning after Judge Moreland issued her final findings, Victoria woke to sunlight streaming through her apartment windows in a way that felt almost defiant. The city beyond the glass was going about its ordinary business, unaware that in a federal courtroom the day before, a conspiracy had been exposed and accountability had been demanded. The world kept turning even when individual worlds collapsed and reformed. She made coffee in the pre-dawn silence and sat at her kitchen table with the final ruling printed out before her. 23 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. The system had failed. People in positions of power had deliberately corrupted protections meant for children. And there would be consequences. Judge Moreland had been thorough and unsparing. She had found systematic violations across 6 pilot districts spanning 7 years. She had documented the deliberate corruption of the framework through training materials and financial incentives. She had named Dr. James Kirkland as the architect of a conspiracy that had harmed more than 2,000 children for profit and political gain. The remedies were sweeping: immediate suspension of all zero-tolerance initiative funding, mandatory retraining of every compliance officer in the pilot districts using materials reviewed by independent juvenile advocates, creation of oversight committees with real authority and community representation, review of every case from the past 7 years for potential framework violations and remediation, and criminal referral. Dr. Kirkland would face federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. The investigation would extend to everyone who had knowingly participated in corrupting the framework implementation. Victoria read through the findings a 3rd time, looking for the paragraph she knew would be there, the one about her own culpability. Victoria Hendricks participated in framework violations for 4 years, including violations in her own daughter's case. However, evidence demonstrates these violations resulted from training and incentive structures deliberately designed to produce such outcomes. Ms. Hendricks's decision to expose these violations, despite severe personal and professional cost, demonstrates accountability that this system has lacked. Her testimony was credible and essential to establishing the pattern of corruption. Not absolution, not exoneration, just acknowledgement that she had been part of a corrupted system and had chosen to expose it rather than continue participating. It would have to be enough. Emily emerged from her bedroom at 7, still in pajamas, hair tangled from sleep. She poured herself coffee and sat across from her mother without speaking. The companionable silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. "Did you sleep?" Emily asked finally. "Some. You?" "Better than I have in years." Emily wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "I kept thinking I would have nightmares. About testifying, about everything becoming public. But instead, I just slept." Victoria understood. The burden of silence had been heavier than the exposure. Speaking truth, even painful truth, created its own kind of relief. "What happens now?" Emily asked. Victoria thought about the question. What did happen now? Her career was over. She faced lawsuits that would take years to resolve and might bankrupt her completely. Her reputation in juvenile justice circles was destroyed. She was 48 years old with no job, diminishing savings, and a future that looked nothing like the one she had planned. "I have no idea." Emily smiled. "Good. I was worried you would have it all figured out already." They spent the morning reading news coverage of the hearing. The story had gone national. Major outlets were covering it as a significant juvenile justice scandal. Editorial boards were calling for investigations in other states. Advocacy groups were demanding congressional hearings. Dr. Kirkland's name was being destroyed in real time. Articles detailed his career, his consulting fees, his political connections. The man who had positioned himself as a juvenile justice reformer was being exposed as someone who had profited from a system that harmed children. Victoria felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness that it had taken so long, that so many children had been harmed before the truth emerged. Her phone rang at 10. Patricia Vance. "Have you seen the news?" "All morning." "Kirkland resigned his position as state policy director an hour ago. His consulting firm is being dissolved, and the state attorney general just announced a task force to investigate framework implementation in every district statewide." Victoria absorbed the information. It is spreading. It is spreading. Other states are launching their own investigations. The Senate Judiciary Committee canceled Kirkland's testimony but scheduled new hearings about juvenile justice reform. They want you to testify. "Me?" "You and Marcus Webb. They want to hear from the person who built the framework and the person who exposed its corruption. Will you do it?" Victoria thought about appearing before Congress, about testifying in Washington, about becoming the public face of this scandal. Everything in her wanted to retreat, to disappear, to let someone else carry this forward. But she thought about the 2,000 children who had been processed through corrupted procedures, about Emily's testimony, about Tyler Ashford finding the courage to tell the truth despite his father's fury, about all the people who had stood up when staying silent would have been easier. "I will do it." After Patricia hung up, Victoria sat with her phone and thought about what congressional testimony would mean. More exposure, more questions about her own failures, more time in the public eye when all she wanted was to rebuild her life quietly. Emily had been listening from the kitchen. "You are going to Washington?" "Apparently." "Can I come with you?" Victoria looked at her daughter. "Em, you do not have to keep doing this. You testified here. You told your truth. You do not owe anyone else your story." "I am not doing it because I owe anyone. I am doing it because it matters." Emily sat down beside her mother. If we can prevent other states from implementing corrupted systems, if we can force actual reform, then everything we went through means something. 3 days later, they flew to Washington together. Marcus Webb traveled with them, carrying boxes of documentation that would support their testimony. On the plane, Victoria watched the country pass beneath them in patchwork squares of farmland and forest, cities connected by highways like veins carrying the country's lifeblood. Somewhere down there were thousands of families navigating juvenile justice systems. Some of those systems worked properly. Others were corrupted in ways large and small. And most families had no idea which they were facing until it was too late. The congressional hearing was scheduled for 2 days after they arrived. Victoria and Emily spent the interim time preparing with Patricia Vance and juvenile justice advocates who had flown in from across the country. They refined testimony, anticipated questions, practiced staying calm under hostile cross-examination. But the real preparation happened in quiet moments. Victoria and Emily walking through the National Mall, talking about everything and nothing. Marcus joining them for dinner, sharing stories about Rachel and the work she had done as a social worker, the fight she had picked with systems that failed children. "She would have liked you," Marcus said to Victoria over dessert. "Rachel believed in second chances. She said everyone deserves the opportunity to choose differently, even people who have already chosen wrong. I chose wrong for 4 years, and then you chose right. That matters more than you think." The hearing room in the Dirksen Senate office building was smaller than Victoria expected, but more intimidating. Senators sat on an elevated dais, looking down at witnesses who faced them from a table that felt exposed and vulnerable. Gallery seating was packed with media, advocates, families who had traveled to watch. Victoria sat between Marcus and Emily, 3 people united by the decision to tell truth to power regardless of cost. The committee chairman opened with a statement about the importance of juvenile justice reform and the disturbing allegations that had emerged from Seattle. Then he turned to Marcus. "Mr. Webb, you authored the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework. Can you explain what you were trying to accomplish?" Marcus spoke with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He explained the framework's core principles: that children in the justice system deserve dignity and protection regardless of what they were accused of, that procedures should be transparent and safeguards should be mandatory, that the system should treat children as people, not problems. "I wrote the framework because I believed we could create a system that held juveniles accountable while protecting their fundamental rights. What I did not anticipate was that people would deliberately corrupt implementation for profit." A senator from Texas asked pointed questions about the training materials. How had compliance officers been taught to circumvent safeguards? Who had designed the training? Who had approved it? Marcus walked through the evidence, the training materials that contradicted the framework, the performance incentives tied to prosecution rates, the funding structures that rewarded aggressive enforcement. This was not accidental drift. This was deliberate sabotage of child protection in service of financial and political interests. Then it was Victoria's turn. She took a breath and began. "My name is Victoria Hendricks. For 4 years, I was Chief Compliance Officer in Seattle. For 4 years, I violated the framework Mr. Webb built. I did this because I was trained to do it, incentivized to do it, and too cowardly to question whether it was legal." She told them about Emily, about violating her own daughter's rights, about the 3 years of silence that followed, about watching herself about to make the same mistake with Sophie Webb and finally finding the courage to stop. "I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can tell you that if you implement juvenile justice reform without mandatory safeguards that cannot be circumvented, you will create systems that harm children while claiming to help them. The framework Mr. Webb built works, but only if it is implemented correctly and overseen by people who cannot profit from violations." The questions were tough. Senators wanted to know how she could have violated her daughter's rights, how she had justified it to herself, why she had waited 4 years to come forward. Victoria answered honestly, "I justified it by calling it procedure. I waited because I was afraid of losing everything. And I only came forward when I was forced to confront that I was about to harm another child the same way I harmed my own." A senator from California, a woman with kind eyes and a reputation for child advocacy, asked the question Victoria had been dreading. "Ms. Hendricks, you are being sued for violating non-disclosure agreements. You face hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. You have lost your career. Why should we believe you are testifying out of conscience rather than self-interest?" Victoria thought about the question. Why should they believe her? She had failed her daughter. She had participated in corruption. She had stayed silent for years. What credibility did she have? "You should not believe me because I am trustworthy. I have proven I am not. You should believe me because the evidence supports what I am saying. The documents are real. The testimony from other witnesses confirms the pattern. And the 2,000 children who were processed through corrupted systems deserve better than a flawed messenger preventing their stories from being heard. Emily testified next. She told the senators what she had told the Seattle courtroom about the assault and the institutional violation that followed, about 3 years of silence, about her mother finally choosing differently. But she added something new. I am studying social work now. I changed my major because I realized I wanted to work in systems that help people, but I wanted to understand how to prevent those systems from becoming corrupted. What happened to me taught me that good intentions are not enough. Systems need safeguards that cannot be undermined by financial incentives or political pressure. A senator asked what reforms she thought were necessary. Independent oversight by community members who have experienced the system. Mandatory documentation that is public and searchable. Financial structures that do not reward aggressive prosecution. And training that teaches compliance officers to prioritize children's dignity over efficiency. The hearing lasted 6 hours. By the end, Victoria was exhausted and oddly energized at the same time. They had told their truth to people who could actually create change. Whether that change would happen remained to be seen, but they had done what they could. That evening, they had dinner with Rebecca Torres, Kirkland's former assistant who had testified in Seattle. She had flown in for the congressional hearing and sat in the gallery taking notes. "How does it feel?" Rebecca asked. "Knowing you changed national policy?" "We have not changed anything yet," Victoria said. "We have just exposed problems. Change requires people in power to actually act." "They will act. I have been in policy long enough to recognize when momentum shifts. This is shifting." Rebecca paused. "I got job offers this week. 3 different advocacy organizations want to hire me to work on juvenile justice reform. Apparently, whistleblowing is a marketable skill now. Are you going to take one?" "I think so. Turns out, destroying my career in government consulting opened up possibilities I had not considered." She smiled. "Sometimes burning bridges lights the way forward." 2 weeks after the congressional hearing, the Senate Judiciary Committee issued recommendations. Mandatory independent oversight for all juvenile justice programs receiving federal funding. Prohibition on performance bonuses tied to prosecution or detention rates. Required training on constitutional rights and framework safeguards. Annual audits and public reporting. The recommendations were not binding, but they created pressure. States that wanted federal funding would have to comply. And states that did not comply would face scrutiny about why they were rejecting child protection standards. Victoria watched the recommendations scroll across her laptop screen and felt something loosen in her chest. Not victory exactly. The children who had already been harmed would not be unharmed by policy changes. But future children might be protected in ways previous generations were not. It had to be enough. The lawsuits were settled 3 months after the hearing. The families who had sued Victoria for violating NDAs agreed to drop their claims in exchange for the state creating a compensation fund for all families whose children had experienced framework violations. Victoria would not have to pay damages, but she also would not get her job back or her reputation restored. She was permanently barred from working in juvenile justice in any official capacity. Patricia Vance called to tell her the settlement terms. "You are free, Victoria. The lawsuit is over." Victoria sat with that word. Free? Was she free? She had no career, no savings to speak of, a future that was undefined in ways both terrifying and liberating. What am I supposed to do now? "Whatever you want. You have earned that." What Victoria wanted, it turned out, was to help in ways that did not require official authority. She started speaking at juvenile justice conferences, telling her story as a cautionary tale about how good people could participate in corrupted systems. She consulted with advocacy groups on how to identify framework violations. She helped train the new oversight committees that were being created in districts across the country. The work paid almost nothing, but it mattered in ways her compliance officer job never had. Emily finished her degree in social work and got a job with a nonprofit that provided advocacy for juveniles in the justice system. She worked with kids who were navigating the same system that had failed her, helping them understand their rights and connecting them with resources. Mother and daughter were both working to fix the system that had broken them. It was not redemption, exactly, but it was purpose. 6 months after the hearing, Marcus Webb called Victoria with a proposal. "I have been approached by the Department of Justice. They want to revise the juvenile dignity protection framework based on what we learned in Seattle. They want input from people who understand how implementation can be corrupted. And they asked you. They asked both of us, you and me, co-authors on the revision. Victoria was silent. The idea of returning to policy work, even in this limited capacity, felt both right and impossible. Marcus, I am the person who violated your framework. Why would you want me involved in revising it? Because you understand how it failed. I understand how it was supposed to work. Together we can build something stronger. They worked on the revision for 8 months. Long sessions in Marcus's kitchen, drafting language that was precise and unambiguous. They strengthened the safeguards, eliminated the flexibility that had been exploited, created enforcement mechanisms that could not be undermined by training materials or political pressure. The new framework required written consent in plain language. It required independent advocates who were paid by entities separate from the compliance office. It required court authorization with specific findings. And it prohibited all performance bonuses tied to prosecution or detention outcomes. Emily reviewed their drafts and pushed them to be even clearer. If a 16-year-old cannot understand their rights by reading this, it is too complicated. They simplified, clarified, refined until the framework was accessible and unambiguous. When they submitted the final draft to the Department of Justice, Marcus turned to Victoria. Rachel would have been proud of this. Of you. I wish I could have met her. You did meet her. In Emily. Your daughter has her fierce refusal to accept systems that harm people. He paused. And you have her courage to change course when you realize you are heading in the wrong direction. The Department of Justice adopted the revised framework a year after the Seattle hearing. Implementation began in pilot districts with intensive monitoring. The early results were dramatic. Prosecution rates dropped by 40%. But more importantly, the children who did enter the system reported feeling respected and heard. Advocates reported that compliance officers were following procedures correctly. The framework worked when people actually followed it. Victoria attended the first oversight committee meeting in Seattle. She sat in the gallery, not as a compliance officer, but as an observer. The committee included juvenile advocates, former system-involved youth, community members, and a compliance officer who had been retrained under the new standards. They reviewed cases with care and precision. They asked questions about consent and advocacy. They held the system accountable in ways it had never been held before. Victoria watched a mother come before the committee with concerns about how her son's case was being handled. The advocates listened. They reviewed documentation. They determined that proper procedure had been followed and explained why to the mother in language she could understand. The mother left satisfied, not because she got the outcome she wanted, but because she had been heard and the process had been fair. This was what the framework was supposed to do. After the meeting, the new chief compliance officer approached Victoria. She was young, maybe 30, with the careful idealism of someone who believed systems could work if implemented correctly. Ms. Hendricks, I wanted to thank you. I was trained using the new materials you helped develop. They are clear and unambiguous in ways the old training never was. You do not need to thank me. I am the reason the old training was necessary.
You are the reason we have better training now. That matters more.
Victoria walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight. The building looked the same as it had 2 years ago when she had been suspended. But everything else had changed. Emily met her outside. She had taken the afternoon off to attend the oversight meeting with her mother. They walked together to a coffee shop they had discovered during the weeks of testimony preparation. How did it feel? Emily asked, being back there. Strange, sad, hopeful. Victoria ordered coffee and they sat by the window. I spent 4 years in that building doing harm while thinking I was following procedure. Watching the new system work correctly feels like seeing what should have always been. Do you regret it, everything that happened? Victoria thought about the question. Did she regret filing the complaint, losing her career, the lawsuits and the exposure and all the costs of choosing truth over silence? I regret that it took me 4 years to see what I was doing. I regret every child I harmed. I regret the 3 years I lost with you. She reached across the table and took Emily's hand. But I do not regret choosing to tell the truth once I finally understood it needed telling. Emily squeezed her mother's hand. I am proud of you, Mom. I know I have said it before, but I need you to really hear it. I am proud of who you became after you stopped being who you were. They sat together in the coffee shop and watched the city move around them. ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that the juvenile justice system had been reformed by people who had been broken by it and chose to fix it rather than stay broken. That evening, Victoria received an email from Maria Rodriguez, Mia's mother. They had stayed in touch since the hearing, occasional messages updating each other on how their daughters were doing. Victoria, I wanted you to know that Mia is thriving. She made the volleyball team. She is talking about becoming a lawyer to help other kids. She still has hard days, but she is not afraid anymore. Thank you for being brave enough to stop the cycle. Maria. Victoria read the email 3 times. Mia was thriving. Sophie was back in school without charges hanging over her. Emily was helping other kids navigate the system. Tyler Ashford was in therapy and working to make amends. The children were healing. Not perfectly, not completely. But they were healing because people had chosen to tell the truth and demand accountability. 6 months later, Victoria stood in another hearing room. Not as a witness this time, but as a trainer. The Department of Justice had hired her to help implement the revised framework in districts across the country. She traveled to courthouses and trained compliance officers on the new procedures. The framework is not complicated, she told a room full of compliance officers in Portland. It requires written consent. It requires independent advocacy. It requires court authorization. Those are not flexible guidelines. They are legal requirements. And if you find yourself being trained to circumvent them, you have an obligation to report that training. A young compliance officer raised her hand. But what if we are pressured by supervisors to be more efficient, to resolve cases faster? Then you document that pressure and report it to the oversight committee. Efficiency is important, but children's dignity is more important. And if you are ever forced to choose between them, you choose dignity. After the training, several compliance officers approached her privately. They had questions about implementation, concerns about political pressure, fear about challenging supervisors. Victoria listened and advised and reminded them that the system only worked if people were willing to hold it accountable. On the flight home, she thought about how strange her life had become. 2 years ago, she had been a compliance officer enforcing corrupted procedures. Now she was training people to resist the same corruption she had once participated in. The transformation was not complete. She still had moments of doubt. She still woke some nights thinking about the children she had harmed. She still carried guilt that would never entirely fade. But she also had purpose. And she had Emily. And she had the knowledge that her failures had led to reforms that would protect children she would never meet. In the moral calculus she had learned from Marcus Webb, that had to count for something. A year after the revised framework was implemented, the Department of Justice released an impact study. Juvenile prosecution rates were down nationally, but more significantly, satisfaction surveys showed that families felt heard and respected by the system. Children reported understanding their rights. Advocates reported that compliance officers were following procedures correctly. The framework worked. Victoria read the study in her apartment while Emily made dinner in the kitchen. They had developed a routine of eating together several times a week, rebuilding the relationship that had fractured 4 years ago. The study came out, Victoria called to the kitchen. Emily appeared in this doorway. And it worked. The framework is actually protecting children the way it was supposed to. Emily smiled. You did that. We did that. You and me and Marcus and Rebecca and everyone who testified, we all did that. They ate dinner together and talked about Emily's caseload at work, about the kids she was helping, about the small victories and ongoing challenges. The conversation was easy in the way that comes from trust rebuilt through consistent action over time. After Emily left, Victoria sat at her kitchen table with the impact study open before her. She thought about the journey from compliance officer to whistleblower to trainer, about the costs and benefits of choosing truth over silence. The costs had been real. Her career was over. Her savings were depleted. Her reputation was permanently marked by her failures. But the benefits were real too. Children were being protected, systems were being held accountable, and she had her daughter back. Victoria looked at the photos on her walls. Emily at every age, growing up in frames, and now new photos. Emily at her social work graduation. Victoria and Emily at the congressional hearing. Marcus and Victoria submitting the revised framework. A visual history of failure and redemption. Of choosing wrong and then choosing right. Of systems breaking and being rebuilt by the people they had broken. The phone rang. Marcus. Did you see the study? Just finished reading it. We did good work, Victoria. We fixed what we broke. We fixed what was broken before we even touched it. We just finally acknowledged the breaking and chose to repair it. He paused. Rachel used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is admit they were wrong and then do the hard work of making it right. You did that. After they hung up, Victoria sat in the quiet of her apartment and felt something she had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but acceptance of who she had been, of what she had done, of who she was becoming. She had been a compliance officer who violated children's rights. That truth did not go away. But she was also a whistleblower who exposed corruption, a mother who rebuilt trust with her daughter, a trainer who helped implement reforms that protected children. Both truths existed simultaneously, the failure and the redemption, the harm caused and the repairs made. Victoria Hendricks had chosen wrong for 4 years, and then she had chosen right. And that second choice, the harder choice, had made all the difference. She stood at her window and looked out at the city, lights beginning to glow as evening deepened into night. Somewhere out there, children were being protected by a framework that actually worked. Families were being treated with dignity by systems that respected their rights. And compliance officers were following procedures that prioritized children over metrics. The work was not finished. Systems would always drift toward corruption without constant accountability. But the framework had been strengthened. The safeguards had been reinforced, and people were watching. Victoria thought about Emily's question from months ago. Do people really change? Or do we just become better at hiding who we are? She still did not know the answer, but she knew that choices mattered, that accountability mattered, that standing up when staying silent would be easier mattered. And she knew that redemption was not a moment but a practice, not a destination but a direction, not absolution but the daily work of choosing better. Victoria Hendricks had spent 4 years choosing badly. She would spend the rest of her life choosing better. It would not undo the harm, but it might prevent future harm. And in the calculus of a life lived imperfectly, that had to be enough. She turned from the window and began preparing for tomorrow's training session. More compliance officers to teach, more systems to help reform, more children to protect through procedures that actually worked. The work continued, the choosing continued, the redemption continued. And somewhere in Seattle, Emily Hendricks helped a frightened 16-year-old understand her rights in the juvenile justice system, explained that she had advocates, that she had choices, that the system was required to treat her with dignity. The girl listened, asked questions, understood that she was not alone, mother and daughter, both doing the work they had been broken into doing, both choosing every day to build systems that protected rather than harmed. The framework held, the safeguards worked, the children were protected, and that made all the difference. 3 years after the hearing, on a clear spring morning, Victoria received a letter. The return address was a therapeutic boarding school in Montana. She opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note from Tyler Ashford. Ms. Hendricks, you do not know me well, but I wanted to write to thank you. After I testified, my relationship with my father ended. I have been in treatment for 2 years, working on understanding why I hurt those girls and learning to be different. Your testimony about choosing to change, even when it costs everything, gave me hope that change is possible. I do not know if I can ever make up for what I did, but I am trying. Thank you for showing me what trying looks like. Tyler. Victoria read the letter twice, then called Emily. Tyler Ashford wrote to me. What did he say? Victoria read the letter aloud. When she finished, Emily was quiet for a long moment. Do you think people can really change, Mom? I think people can choose differently. Whether that is change or just choosing better, I am not sure. But Tyler is choosing better. You are helping kids choose better, and I am trying to help systems work better. Victoria paused. Maybe that is all redemption ever is, choosing better, and hoping it accumulates into something meaningful. That summer, the Department of Justice invited Victoria to speak at a national conference on juvenile justice reform. She stood before 500 people and told her story without flinching from the ugly parts. I violated my daughter's rights. I participated in systematic corruption. I stayed silent for 4 years while children were harmed. And then I made a different choice, not because I was brave, but because I finally understood that staying silent was worse than speaking up. She talked about the costs of telling truth, the lawsuits, the lost career, the destroyed reputation, but also the benefits, the reforms, the protected children, the relationship rebuilt with her daughter. Systems only change when people choose to change them, and that choosing always costs something. The question is whether the cost of change is greater than the cost of complicity. For me, it was not. And I hope for you, it is not either. The applause when she finished was sustained and genuine. Afterwards, dozens of compliance officers approached her with questions and stories. Some were struggling with corrupted systems in their districts. Some had already exposed violations and were facing retaliation. All of them needed to know they were not alone. Victoria listened and advised and reminded them that choosing right was hard but necessary. In the audience, Emily watched her mother and felt pride that was no longer complicated by anger or betrayal. Just pride. Her mother had failed spectacularly and then worked tirelessly to repair the damage. That was worth celebrating. Marcus sat beside Emily, having flown in for the conference. "Your mother has become quite the advocate." "She learned from the best," Emily said. "She learned from necessity, and from you. Watching you testify, seeing your courage, that changed her in ways I never could have." That evening, Victoria and Emily and Marcus had dinner together at a restaurant overlooking the Potomac. They talked about the conference, about the reforms spreading across the country, about the children being protected. 2,000 kids were harmed by the corrupted system, Marcus said. But the reforms we built are protecting hundreds of thousands. The math works out in favor of speaking up. Does the math ever really work out when we are talking about children? Emily asked. Each one of those 2,000 kids mattered individually. They were not numbers. You are right. They were people, and we failed them. Marcus set down his glass. But we cannot undo that failure. We can only prevent it from continuing. That is what you both have done, what we all have done together. They raised their glasses in a toast, not to victory, not to redemption, just to the work of choosing better and hoping it mattered. 5 years after the hearing, the Juvenile Dignity Protection Framework was being used in 43 states. The reforms Victoria and Marcus had written were protecting children across the country. Compliance officers were being held accountable. Oversight committees were functioning. The system was not perfect, but it was better, measurably, demonstrably better. Victoria stood in her apartment and looked at the wall of photos that documented her journey. Emily's graduation from social work school, Victoria receiving an award from a juvenile justice advocacy organization, Marcus presenting the revised framework to the Department of Justice, Rebecca Torres starting a nonprofit to train compliance officers nationwide, a visual history of people choosing to rebuild what corruption had broken. Her phone buzzed with the text from Emily. "Dinner tonight? I have news." They met at their usual restaurant. Emily was glowing in a way Victoria had not seen since before the assault. "I have been offered a position, Director of Juvenile Advocacy for the Northwest region. I would be overseeing framework implementation across 5 states. Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. That is incredible. It is because of you, because of what we did, because we chose to speak up." Emily reached across the table. "They want you too, as a consultant, training compliance officers. Would you do it?" Victoria thought about the question. She was 53 years old. She had been working as a trainer and consultant for 5 years, traveling to courthouses across the country, helping implement the framework she had once violated. The work was meaningful, but it was also exhausting. Part of her wanted to rest, to step back, to let others carry the work forward. But she looked at her daughter, at this fierce young woman who was dedicating her life to protecting children from the systems that had failed her. And she knew the answer. "I will do it." They worked together for the next 3 years. Mother and daughter, implementing reforms across the Northwest. They trained compliance officers. They established oversight committees. They reviewed cases and held systems accountable. It was hard work, but it mattered. On Victoria's 56th birthday, Emily threw her a small party, just family and close friends. Marcus brought homemade bread and stories about Rachel. Rebecca flew in from D.C. Patricia Vance came with updates about continued reforms. They sat together in Victoria's apartment and celebrated not just a birthday, but a journey. From complicit compliance officer to whistleblower to reformer. From broken relationship to rebuilt trust. From systematic corruption to meaningful accountability. Marcus raised his glass. To Victoria, who proved that it is never too late to choose differently. To Victoria, everyone echoed it. That night, after everyone left, Victoria sat alone with the quiet and thought about the past 8 years. About everything that had broken and everything that had been rebuilt. She had lost her career, but found purpose. She had lost her reputation, but gained integrity. She had lost 3 years with her daughter, but rebuilt that relationship into something stronger than before. The trade was not equal. The costs had been real and painful, but the alternative had been continuing to participate in corruption while calling it procedure, and she could not live with that anymore. Victoria stood at her window one last time, looking out at the city that had been the site of her greatest failure and her hardest redemption. Tomorrow she would travel to another courthouse to train another group of compliance officers. She would tell them her story. She would teach them the framework. She would remind them that children's dignity mattered more than efficiency. And some would listen. Some would implement the procedures correctly. Some would hold systems accountable when they started to drift. Not all of them, but enough. And enough, Victoria had learned, was sometimes all you could ask for. She turned from the window and prepared for tomorrow. The work continued, the choosing continued, the redemption continued. One child at a time, one system at a time, one choice at a time. It was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she had chosen after finally understanding what mattered. And that made all the difference.